warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Peace be upon you all, and welcome to the Rethinking Islamic Reform Conference. We begin in the name of God, the most merciful, the most kind. I'd like to say good evening to everyone. Thank you all for being here, and thank you all for your patience. My name is Miriam Francois Jarrah, and I'll be hosting tonight's Rethinking Islamic Reform Conference on behalf of Oxford University Islamic Society. I'd like to extend a warm welcome to our esteemed speakers, Sheikh Hamza Yusuf Hanson, with us all the way from the Zaytuna Institute in California, USA, and Professor Tariq Ramadan, with us all the way from the Oxford University Middle East Centre up on Woodstock Road. First off, I'd like to extend a particularly warm welcome to our guests who have joined us this evening from across the globe. Some of you have travelled almost as far as some of our speakers, from as far afield as Australia, America, Tunisia, Sweden, Malaysia, Indonesia, Cambodia, Switzerland, Poland, Holland, Norway, and Bradford. We're grateful to all of you for your presence here tonight. We're also delighted to welcome our professors and fellow students from Oxford University, as well as our fellow academics from universities such as Cambridge, Sussex, Warwick, SOAS, LSE, and many more. We'd also like to thank the governmental institutions present here tonight, such as the Home Office, the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, the US State Department, and diplomats from numerous embassies, such as the American, Egyptian, Saudi Arabian, and Indonesian embassies. We're also grateful to have such a fantastic representation from the media here tonight, with the BBC, Channel 4, The Guardian, The Times, and many more in attendance. Also, a special thanks goes to Peter Sanders for putting his talent to tonight's photography. Finally, we're pleased to welcome representatives from every sector of civil society, whose presence greatly honours us this evening. Welcome all of you to Oxford. Oxford seems a fitting setting for the hosting of this event. With its age-old traditions, odd customs, and at times perplexing dress codes, it's a place where tradition breeds innovation, where new ideas emerge from 13th century colleges, and where old-fashioned tutorials are regarded as a marker of our educational excellence. Those who come to Oxford realise it's much more than a university. It's a culture which blends its history in respect of its traditions with a conscious and selective appropriation of modernity. Some of the more famous Oxford traditions include the wearing of carnations during exams, or the boat race, or May morning celebrations. My personal favourite is the time ceremony, an ancient tradition whereby students walk backwards around Merton College courtyard when the clocks go back, in order to ensure that mystical time particles, known as chronicles, that's the technical term, don't disrupt the space-time continuum. It is vital for the continued existence of the universe. As Muslims, we're uniquely placed to relate to the ways in which tradition serves to ground, solidify, and enhance not only this university, but also our faith, and recognise the value of incorporating new understandings and ideas into that body of tradition, as a way not of diluting it, but of exalting and enriching it. Tonight's event is hosted in what many describe as the jewel in Oxford's architectural crown. Some of you may have noticed above our heads a 32-panel painted ceiling designed by Sir Christopher Wren. It depicts truth descending upon the arts and sciences and expelling ignorance from the university. Muslims believe that one of God's names is indeed the truth, and so for many of us, the meaning behind this artistic endeavour has a very special resonance. Indeed, in chapter 24 of the Quran, God says, "God is the truth that makes all things manifest." It is under this ideal of making truth manifest that the Sheldonian has hosted countless distinguished speakers and leading thinkers, from the Queen to the Dalai Lama and Mother Teresa. And tonight, we also aspire to expel ignorance, drawing on divine inspiration, as we address one of the most talked about topics of our time, reform in the Islamic tradition. Tonight's event is hosted by Oxford University Islamic Society, one of the largest and most active student societies at the university. I'd thus like to introduce to you our ISOC president, Aminul Islam, who will come and say a few words about our society. So please welcome Aminul Islam.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is an honor, as the president of the Oxford University Islamic Society, to be able to welcome you all here today the most prestigious of venues, for what is most certainly a magnificent occasion. My task here today is to introduce us, your hosts, the Oxford University Islamic Society. I'm meant to explain who we are, what we do, and how we fit into the university at large. But I would like to take an unconventional route, if I may, by first drawing attention to our attire this evening, the so-called sub-fusk, the official academic dress of the University of Oxford. The sub-fusk is an integral part of any Oxford student's life, and we wear it during ceremonies or events of great magnitude. We wear it when we matriculate and are accepted into the university. We wear it when we graduate from the university. We wear it for exams, for official meetings, and sometimes even to dinner. It is the highest level of clothing we can display, and so we wear it today. We wear it to honor this occasion. We wear it to honor our speakers, and we wear it to honor you. Many people think, and I'm inclined to agree, that the sub-fusk is beautiful. Others, however, think it makes us look like penguins. Despite what people may think of the sub-fusk, it is intriguing to discover that despite it being an age-old Oxford tradition, it does not originate in Oxford, nor even in England. Instead, it takes its roots from the universities and madrasas of the Islamic world, which predate Oxford. The gown is the equivalent of the robes of the madrasa student. The mortarboard, which I now hold in my hand, and which we cannot wear until we graduate, symbolizes the Quran, which graduates in the Muslim world used to tie to their heads at their graduation ceremonies. Similarly, whenever we are in sub-fusk, we are to carry the mortarboard, just as students in the Islamic tradition used to continually carry their Qur'ans with them. The right to put it on one's head coming only at the end of one's study, when they are worthy of such an act. So when we wear these clothes dating from ancient traditions, we are aligning ourselves to the shared traditions of Oxford and Islam. Whilst the world changes around us, Oxford remains the same, holding fast to our shared values of truth, creativity, and freedom of thought. Just as sub-fusk does not change, we believe that Oxford and Islam remain unchanging at the center of positive change. Accordingly, we continue to strive to be that positive change. In Hillary term alone, we hosted one of our speakers tonight, Tariq Ramadan, in Oxford's most famous debating chamber, the Oxford Union, to talk about jihad. We also hosted a seminar in polygamy in the home of the world's most prestigious scholarship, Rhodes House, and a workshop on Islamic art in Britain's first museum, the Ashmolean. Is it not then appropriate that today we are holding Rethinking Islamic Reform, the most pressing issue in Islam, here in the Sheldonian Theatre, the most prestigious venue in Oxford? This level of excellence which we strive for is down to the hard work and vision of our members. I would then like to take this opportunity to thank my team for all that they have done for this event and for making all of this possible. I once again welcome you to Oxford, and I hope you enjoy the evening. Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you, Aminul. Tonight's speakers are more remarkable than my short introduction of their achievements could possibly convey. But obviously, I'm going to give it a go. Hamza Yusuf Hanson is one of the leading Islamic thinkers and speakers in the Western world today. After converting to Islam at the age of 17, Hamza Yusuf studied with some of the most notable scholars in the Arab world for over a decade, receiving a number of teaching licenses in classical Islamic subjects. Following this, he returned to the US to earn degrees in healthcare and religious studies. His years of meticulous traditional study, intellectual rigor, and eloquence have placed him at the very forefront of Islamic intellectual discourse. In 1996, Sheikh Hamza co-founded the Zaytuna Institute in California, which has established an international reputation for reviving the study of classical Islamic studies in the West, and has since become America's first ever accredited Muslim college. As one of the most recognized and respected voices, Sheikh Hamza regularly delivers lectures at venues drawing tens and thousands of supporters. He has advised both the White House and the Arab League, and most recently was a guest speaker at Tony Blair's Faith Foundation. We're deeply honored to welcome Sheikh Hamza to the stage. Professor Ramadan is one of the world's foremost and renowned intellectuals in Islamic academia. Born in Geneva, he has a PhD in Arabic and Islamic studies and received intensive training in classical Islamic scholarship at Al-Azhar University, Cairo. A senior research fellow at St. Anthony's College, he was appointed Chair of Contemporary Islamic Studies at Oxford University in 2009. In addition to serving as president of the Brussels-based European Muslim Network, Professor Ramadan works as an expert in various commissions linked to the Brussels Parliament. He's also a member of several working parties throughout the world. Dubbed a Muslim Martin Luther, he has repeatedly been named as one of the most important contemporary intellectuals of our time, including by the British Prospect and American Foreign Policy magazines. Time magazine also recognized him as amongst the 100 most important innovators of the 21st century. He has advised numerous Western governments, including the American administration, the British government, and recently the French government, and has written more than 20 books. Please join me in welcoming him to the stage. Tonight's event will be chaired by head organizer and former ISOC president himself, Imad Ahmed. I'll hand over to him now to present tonight's topic. Welcome, Imad.
Thank you, Miriam. Actually, Miriam is one of our stars in the Islamic Society. She is our media representative and regularly represents us on many pertinent issues to a variety of media outlets. Most recently, she was on the BBC, she was in The Times, in The Guardian. All incidentally, we have represented here in our audience here today. Thank you to Aminal as well. As we can tell from Aminal's speech, he's a person who brings ideas together beautifully. And it is through his vision, his character, energy, and leadership that such a project could come into fruition. So thank you, Aminal. Now, moving on to the event itself, it's strange to think that this just started as an idea amongst some friends, and now it's turned into something of this magnitude. Our distinguished audience on the floor, with representation from the government, policymakers, think tanks, scholars, and community leaders, is a testament to how important the question of Islamic reform has become. Yet the notion of reform itself, despite being one of the most oft-repeated, remains ill-defined. The title of our conference itself is a victim of the ambiguity that surrounds this discourse. Indeed, in a conversation that we had with Sheikh Hamza a few days ago, he began to unpack the title, Rethinking Islamic Reform. Well, what do we mean by reform? Do we mean theological reform, political reform, structural reform? And what is inherently Islamic about the reform that might take place or should take place? And to use the word rethinking, when we say rethinking, are we implying that reform has been sufficiently thought about such that we need to think about it again? In spite of the lack of clarity as to our definitions, this catch-all term of reform has spurred many projects with diverging aims and contradictory trajectories, often with institutional support and indeed governmental support. Some have considered the efforts of many reform projects to be wholly counterproductive, if not inattentive and offensive to the Muslim community. Most recently, a House of Commons committee highlighted the sensitivity of the issue, reporting that much of the effort towards reform had been stigmatizing and potentially alienating to the Muslim community that these projects were claiming to serve. In fact, we are pleased to have Dr. Phyllis Starkey, who headed the publication of this government report, here today in our audience. Now, I know you don't want to see me here speaking for much longer, so I'm about to go, but just before I go, please allow me to outline the questions which this conference aims to answer. They broadly fall into 4 strands, so I'll go through them in turn. Firstly, what is Islamic reform? What is legitimate Islamic reform? And where are its spheres and its remits? Secondly, why have Islamic reform projects thus far been met with distrust and trepidation from the Muslim grassroots? We would like this answered with a special reference to contemporary reform initiatives. Thirdly, what is the interaction between Islam and the political, social, religious and cultural discourses surrounding it, if any? In other words, is the call to Islamic reform being affected from the outside, or is it an impulse that comes from within? And finally, and perhaps quite pertinently with the new government, with our new coalition government, what roles, if any, should governments play in Islamic reform, and what are the challenges they face? To answer these questions, may I ask our first esteemed guest speaker, Sheikh Hamza, to take the stage. Thank you very much, Sheikh Hamza.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Allahumma salli wa sallam ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam tasliman kathira wa la hawla wa la quwwata illa billah al-ali al-azim. In the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate, and peace and prayers be upon all of the prophets of God and upon our Prophet Muhammad. Alhamdulillah. I'm going to try to address each one of these points that I've been asked to address, but before that, I'd like to preface my remarks by talking about a specific problem that we have when we look at the Islamic tradition, when we look at Islam as a faith, and when we are addressing an audience that contains both peoples from the Islamic faith of various, obviously, types and backgrounds, and then of Western people. In science, you have what are called non-complementary paradigms. And to give an example of that, Newtonian physics is a certain way of viewing the world, and it works at a certain level. But if you attempt to apply Newtonian physics to quantum mechanics, it doesn't work. You have a non-complementary system attempting to address things that are very different and need a different language to describe them and a different theoretical basis to make sense of them. In many ways, the post-industrial, increasingly postmodern Western liberalism is akin to quantum mechanics, and the Islamic tradition is more akin to Newtonian physics. And so when the two of us attempt to talk, we're speaking completely different languages. And it really creates a massive barrier. Let me give you one example. One of the fundamental premises of the Islamic tradition is that human activity has metaphysical impact, that what we do in the world is actually reflected back to us through the world. So natural disasters are not seen as simply events that happen because of tectonic plate shifts, but there's actually a relationship between human behavior and between what is happening in the world. For many, many Western peoples now, that idea is a quaint, superstitious, historical idea from a previous time, something very difficult for Western people to actually relate to. One of the problems with that idea, however, and I do put this caveat, is that many Muslims will use that as a way of pointing the finger at people and saying, this is why it's happening. You're an evil person and therefore God is zapping you. That is also a major problem because there's nothing in the Islamic tradition that permits one to do that, because it is arrogating to oneself the judgment of God, and that's simply not in the realm of a human being to do. And so that's a very important point. Another aspect that is very difficult for, I think, Western peoples to relate to is the fact that the primary texts of Islam are 1,400 years old. And it is very difficult for Western people to understand how you can use a text that was written 1,400 years ago to have anything to do with modern legislation. This seems really quite incomprehensible for many people. And to give you an example, in the United States, we have a 200-year-old document. It's actually older than 200 years, but we have a document that is a little older than 200 years called the Constitution. It's the basis of our legal system. In the arguments that we have in the United States of America, we have arguments around what they call strict construction and loose construction, how we interpret the Constitution, originalism versus a living Constitution, the idea of what's called textualism in our tradition, intentionalism. What's the intent of the framers when they said these things? And should we base it on their intent, even though they were speaking 200 years ago in a very different context? Or is it a living constitution that can be reinterpreted based on the changes of time? The Founding Fathers didn't really leave a lot of explanation of how they wanted it to be understood, although there are some remarks. Thomas Jefferson said that you can't expect an adult to wear the coat of a child, and countries grow, and therefore our understanding will grow, and there needs to be changes. But he also said, but don't allow the Constitution to be wax in the hands of the government to where they can shape it to fit the way they want. This dilemma that exists in the United States is very similar to the dilemma that Muslims are going through today. There are many Muslims that are arguing for a living Quran as opposed to a type of textualist approach or intentionalist approach to the Quran. How do we interpret the Quran in the light of modern society? Now, the reason that I really wanted to drive that point home is because the problems of law and language are perennial problems. We still study Plato because Plato raises questions that are still pertinent to people living today. We still study Aristotle because Aristotle also addresses issues that are pertinent to people today. And so, in light of looking at the past to illuminate the present, I would like to honor a graduate of Oxford and an Oxford Don who I really like. And that is the great Arnold Toynbee. Arnold Toynbee studied at Balliol College, and I'm speaking about Arnold J. Toynbee, not the great economist of the 19th century who also has that same name. Arnold Toynbee wrote an essay in 1947 called he wrote a series of essays in a book called Civilization on Trial. One of the things that he said in that book is that when civilizations are confronted with challenges, they tend to respond in different ways, and their responses will determine their success or their failures. But he said one of the common characteristics of a civilization when they're under great stress is to find what he called bugbears, people to blame for their problems. And he mentions now the capitalist West, it uses communism. He said in the divided world of 1947, communism and capitalism are each performing this insidious office for one another. Whenever things go awry in circumstances that seem ever more intractable, we tend to accuse the enemy of having sown tares in our field and thereby implicitly excuse ourselves for the faults in our own husbandry. This is, of course, an old story. Centuries before communism was heard of, our ancestors found their bugbear in Islam. As lately as the 16th century, Islam inspired the same hysteria in Western hearts as communism in the 20th century. It's very interesting in this same essay that he actually argues that Islam is also going to become a problem again. And he addresses what is very fascinating to me, the fact that Islam is up against the wall vis-a-vis Western civilization. And because it's up against the wall, it responds in one of two ways. He calls one of the responses Herodianism and the other Zealotism. Herodianism, he said, is mimicry. It's attempting to find the secret of the people that have conquered you and to become like them. This is the Japanese response to the post-World War situation where the Japanese now have better rock and roll than the Americans. They can imitate Elvis Presley. Even their prime minister, when he came to America, he wanted to go to Graceland. That was the first place that he asked George Bush to go to, and he actually did go and visit because he apparently is a great fan of Elvis. They have some of the finest classical musicians. This is very common for conquered peoples to imitate those who have conquered them. This is why Native Americans are often the last people wearing cowboy clothes, literally wearing the Levi's and the cowboy. They will embellish it with traditional beads and things, but This is something that happens. But he says the other response is zealotism, which is an attempt to fall back on the past in this rigid, nostalgic structure. And he identifies 3 places where he feels that this will be the biggest problem for the West in dealing with the Muslims. Saudi Arabia, Afghanistan, and Yemen. And it's quite stunning that he did this in 1947, and I would attribute that to the Oxford education. So we're looking forward to such prescient understandings of the future from these young Muslims that are coming out of here. But one of the things that he says is that the problem with Herodianism is that the mimicry is always pale imitation. They can never become really as good as those that they're trying to imitate. And he says the problem with zealotism is that it is invariably a dead end, and it comes to a failure. Now, in terms of looking at Islamic reform today, I have a problem with the word, and I clarified it with Dr. Ramadan, and the word that he understands reform is islah in Arabic, which is a good Arabic term. Islah is the idea of rectifying something after it's corrupted. And it's a good word because the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ actually used that word when he said that he said, "Blessed are the strangers," and he was asked who the strangers were, and he said, "They are people who rectify my sharia, my way, after people have corrupted it." So he said, الَّذِينَ يُصْلِحُونَ الشَّرِيعَةِ بَعْدَمَا أَفْسَدَهَا النَّاسِ. The importance of that tradition is 2 things that can be immediately gleaned from it. One is that his sharia does get corrupted by his own testimony, that it can be misunderstood, it can deviate from its original intentions. But then the other thing is the need for people to rectify it, this islah, this idea of rectifying it. Now, the problem for me with the language, reform is more of a Christian term coming out of the Protestant Reformation, which was a response to the abuses. And I know it's the most radical of the Protestant Reformation came out of Switzerland. So so Zwingli was actually more radical than Martin Luther. But the end was the banking state of Switzerland, and this is often the danger of reformations, because there's a wonderful statue of Calvin in Geneva, because the bankers loved the fact that the Protestants allowed for usury, whereas the Catholics opposed usury, and now we're living in a world that is economically disintegrating before our eyes because of this hegemonic banking madness that is so out of hand. But the idea of reform, of Islamic reform, is an old idea, and the idea of using a language that comes out of another set of historical problems, for me, is problematic. My own teacher, Sheikh Abdullah bin Bey, when we spoke about this, I asked him, and he speaks French, and he knew he knows the history of the Reformation and the use of the term, and he said that he preferred the word renovation and use that as French, because it's closer to the idea of tajdid. The idea of reformation, because reformation can be a complete restructuring of something, whereas in the Islamic tradition, the idea is that the house is fundamentally of sound, it's of sound foundation, but it often needs renovating. It needs renovating. Sometimes the faucets aren't working anymore. The water's not flowing. People aren't getting fresh air because the windows can't be opened. So you need people to come in and renovate the house. And this is the idea. Now, this process has been going on for centuries. There's an idea, what's wrong with the Muslims? Why won't they change? If you look at the Muslims today, the Muslims of the 19th century would not recognize the Muslims of today. The radical changes that have occurred in the Muslim world in the last 30 years, let alone the last 100 years, are beyond belief. If you look at Arabic culture, and the fact that MTV, that there is a Muslim version, not a Muslim, but an Arabic version of MTV, which is as racy as the MTV that people experience in the Western Hemisphere. Now, people like an Osama bin Laden, who turns that on and sees that, literally will pull their beards out because it's incredibly traumatic. to see something like that happening in their culture. The Arabs pride themselves on what's called ghayra. In Urdu, it's translated as ghayrat. Urdu people say that's where the Arabs got it from, but it's actually the other way around. Ghayra is the concept of, it's a type of jealousy. It's the idea of coveting something so much that you're willing to fight for it. And I don't think people in the West can really appreciate anymore the degree to which this virtue in Islamic and Arabic tradition is still upheld. I certainly believe that that was a far more dominant virtue, say in the 19th century in the West, but it's certainly something, now it's a very much live and let live attitude. And there are reasons for that. 2 world wars in Europe have led to a certain way of looking at the world. The crises that happened in the West because of 180 million people dying. We tend to want the Muslim world to catch up with us. What's wrong with you? Why can't you catch up with us? And yet we don't realize that we have been through, in the West, so much trauma to get to this point that we're at. And the Muslim world had a different set of historical traumas, much of it, in fact, a result of colonialism. So we have very different historical circumstances. Now, in terms of what is legitimate renovation or tajdeed, I would argue that the Islamic tradition is a vast tradition. The Islamic tradition is largely unread. Even people now that are studying in madrasas, studying at Sharia colleges, do not go deeply into this tradition. This is simply a fact. One of the things, I'll give you one example. When I wrote a paper on female prayer, because this was an issue a few years ago, years ago when I was a student in Mauritania, I remembered in a book that Ibn Ayman from the Maliki madhab considered female prayers was permissible in that madhab. And I remember as a 21-year-old student underlying that. I actually went back to the book and found my underlining that statement. When I studied the prayer issue, I was so struck by the fact that not only was it debated early on, but there were multiple opinions. Imam Tabari considered it permissible for women to lead the prayer if they were more qualified than men, to lead men in prayer. Ibn Taymiyyah himself permitted women to lead men in prayer if they were illiterate and she was literate. He just said she should lead from back because she might distract the men if she was leading from the front. Ibn Taymiyyah permitting a woman to lead men in prayer. Right? I mean, this is the tradition. It's all there. People have no idea how many of these issues were already examined, discussed, and incredible erudition and energy went into this. So if you look, I would argue that the Islamic tradition has within itself all of the needs to renovate the house. But it's going to take an immense amount of intellectual energy. It's going to take very, very highly qualified people, which necessitates institutions that can train and produce the types of people that are needed to engage in this activity. Usul al-fiqh is one of the great, which is in essence, it's the philosophy of legislation in the Islamic tradition. Much of the Quran and the Hadith is in fact closer to what we would call constitutional law in the West. It's not statute law. The Prophet ﷺ gives far more constitutional expressions and legal injunctions than he ever gives cut and dry statute law. Do this, don't do that. He leaves things open. There's an immense amount of ambiguity in the Hadith. This was known early on. There are very few verses of the Quran and Hadith that are considered what is known as qat'iyyat al-dilala, which is where the understanding of the expression is absolute, that we know exactly what it means. It often holds 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 meanings, and you get all of these multiple interpretations. The other thing that's so extraordinary about our early scholars is that they were very well aware of what we would call in the West fallibilism, that they were not dictating God's law in their jurisprudence. They were dictating the mujtahid, or the individual's understanding of God's law. In fact, Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyya in I'lam al-Muwaqqi'in has a chapter entitled The Prohibition of Calling a Fatwa the Ruling of God. The prohibition of calling a fatwa the ruling of God. The fatwa is a personal opinion of a mujtahid in attempting to understand the intention of a text. Moreover, the fatwa was known and understood to be specific, in many cases, to time and place. This is another aspect of fatwas that are rarely understood, even amongst people that are trained in classical Islamic education. The Hanafi school believes that the place actually affects the ruling, even though the other 3 schools do not in the Sunni tradition. So if you're in England, there are certain rulings that would be permissible here that might not be permissible in another place. Other scholars argue no. But these are the differences of opinion and the nuances. This is another aspect. The Muslims have always recognized diversity and difference of opinion. But we have what are called thawabit and mutaghayyirat in our Islamic tradition. The thawabit are things that do not change. They cannot be reformed. One of them is our basic understanding of God, our basic understanding of prophecy, our basic understanding of eschatology, of what happens after life. These things are fixed and eternal. They don't change with time and place. God is all-powerful, omniscient. He speaks, and He has no gender, even if we use gender language to express the divine by the limitations of language. But Muslim theologians were always clear there is no gender to God. God is neither male nor female, transcendent. So that aspect cannot change. What changes then? The changes are our understandings. But those understandings have to be based on following rigorous principles. The first and foremost is they have to be within the context of the language in which the revelation was revealed. And this is why, as opposed to living constitution, the idea that the language and the intent of the framers of the Constitution have no relevance to us today. This is a debate. This is a very important departure for the vast majority of Muslims with certain reformist movements today. The idea that somehow we can reinterpret the Quran in the light of 21st century language. The Quran was written in Arabic of the 7th century. That Arabic was preserved to a degree by which only people who really have studied this tradition understand. It is one of the great human achievements, the preservation of the Arabic language, the exact meanings of every single word that is recorded in the Quran, of all the words that are recorded in the Hadith, and having to prove what those words mean. And on rare occasion, saying we can't ascertain the exact meaning of this word or the multiple possible meanings, like the word ib, which is in Surah Abasa. So the Muslims, jurists, traditionally believed that you could not go outside of the language. You were confined by the language. Now, the other aspect of this, which is very important, is they were always aware of the ambiguous nature of language. The Quran is open to multiple interpretations and multiple meanings and will be until the end of time. Verses can be reinterpreted in the light of new knowledge and have and will continue to be. So, the Islamic reform or tajdeed that's happened in the past, we have many examples of that. But I would look at a few that occurred in the 19th century. In the late 19th century, with the colonial incursions, there became a response to the Western colonization of the Muslim countries. Some of those responses involved attacking Muslim spirituality because they believed, like Muhammad Abdu and others, they believed that the Muslims were far too otherworldly, that the Sufis had taken hold of their understanding to such a degree that they really forgot about the world itself. And so the emphasis then was to focus on the political, the economic dimensions that had been ignored for so long. And so you got these reformist movements that were essentially political and economic attempts at redressing the real problems in the Muslim world, educational problems, the fact that things like engineering were so widely ignored, attempting to redress the problems of Muslim universities. Al-Azhar is a good example of that. Al-Azhar was traditionally only where people were trained in Islamic tradition, and now it is a multidimensional, multifaceted university. That was an attempt at reforming the problem of limiting Islamic universities simply to the subjects of Islamic tradition. Then you had the political movements of which Dr. Ramadan's grandfather was involved in on his maternal side, Hassan al-Banna, who was part of that tradition of Rashid Rida, who was also one of the reformist trends that occurred in the Muslim world. Ben Badis, who is affected by that in Algeria, so you have a complete reformist agenda in Algeria, and then you have Ala al-Fasi in Morocco. These are all happening on top of the Wahhabi reformist movement that was happening even earlier than that in the 1780s, 1790s, and then it's reinvigorated with King Abdulaziz's conquest of the Arabian Peninsula. These are all attempts at reform, of dealing with the collapse of the Muslim sovereignty and the Muslim ethos. One of the great traumas of the Muslim world was in 1924 when the Ottoman Caliphate officially dismantled. There was a conference in Mecca that was done to reestablish it, to appoint a new caliph. The head of that conference was Muhammad al-Zawahiri, who was the grandfather of Ayman Zawahiri, the companion of Osama bin Laden. He was the Sheikh al-Azhar at the time. I mean, this is quite extraordinary. Ayman Zawahiri's grandfather on his maternal side wrote the Egyptian constitution. He was one of the most important people in designing the Egyptian constitution. He comes from a very traditional, very aristocratic Egyptian family. So what happened between Muhammad Zawahiri and Ayman Zawahiri? I mean, how did that chasm occur to where you end up responding instead of the famous statement of Muhammad Zawahiri in 1924 after they couldn't elect a caliph in Mecca? He said, let's do the janazah prayer over, which is the funeral prayer of the Muslims, over the nation of Islam. That was Muhammad Zawahiri, his grandfather's response to the inability to elect a caliph. Now, what's happening now as you get this extraordinary postmodern environment that we're in now, where the internet has opened up all of this extraordinary exchange of ideas, and you have many, many Muslims that have migrated to the West, have imbibed Western liberalism, have imbibed many of the concepts of the West. They're struggling. There is a lot of soul-searching going on. We have, for instance, gay and lesbian people in the United States, and I'm sure here, but in the United States, we have gay and lesbian people who are born into Muslim families that want a gay and lesbian Islam. They want an Islam that is big enough to include the gay and lesbian community. And so there's a movement now there. You have people like Irshad Manji, who is also calling for this reform. The misunderstanding, I think the trouble with Islam today, becoming a spokesman for a certain type of progressive movement. The question is, why is there so much distrust and trepidation by the Muslim grassroots? I would say the fundamental reason is because Lord Cromer, and I don't know if he went to Oxford, but Lord Cromer, who was the governor of Egypt, a close friend of Muhammad Abdu's, said, a reformed Islam is not Islam. And I would argue that that is true and that's not true. It's true in that the fundamental thrust of Islam is that it was a reformist movement to begin with. Islam was redressing the problems that they saw inherent in Christianity, the sectarianism. People have no idea the number of sects of Christians that existed in the Middle East at that time. The Nestorians, the Jacobites, the Arians, the Byzantine Orthodox, the Catholics, all of these different groups. The Malibari Nasranis, who are still in existence in India, had to flee to India, who were Semitic Christians like Ebionites. All of these differences. And then also the Jewish rejection of Jesus. So the Prophet Muhammad saw himself as coming to really reform the Abrahamic tradition. He put in place several constraints in his faith. And also in the Quran you will find many verses warning not to change the faith. There are many warnings about this. The Prophet, one of the most fundamental concepts in Muslim consciousness is the idea of bid'ah, is the idea of innovation, of changing the structure of things. And this is why the Muslims are very, very wary of messing with the calibration of this religion. This is why when they see new ideas like this, they tend to react. This is the grassroots of Muslims. This, I do not believe, will change for any time soon. I really don't. I think that you will find, and in the Muslim world, this is particularly acute, far less so here. I think Western Muslims are extremely tolerant of many divergent opinions. Even the spectrum of our understanding is quite broad, and what we allow to go under the umbrella is much broader than in many places in the Muslim world. Not all places, but in many places in the Muslim world. But the Muslims historically have been very tolerant of dissent. Now, there is an argument here about British Islam, and I want to talk about that and then make my closing remarks. There's an argument somehow that the British Muslims need to assimilate. They need to fully become British. And there's this problem with multiculturalism. Multiculturalism is threatening the cohesion of our society. I'm amazed at the idea of cohesion. I'd like to see it, where all this wonderful cohesion is. I think people that are in their 70s in this room can remember how cohesive neighborhoods were 60 years ago, 70 years ago. They're much less so today, and I'm old enough to remember how my neighborhood was and how my neighborhood is today. So we have social fragmentation is a problem everywhere. Now, the argument that America, and I find it extraordinary that Brits will tolerate this from your politicians, the argument of saying, look at America, how cohesive they are. They all pledge allegiance to the flag. You know, they have Thanksgiving. You know, everybody has a national turkey day. And, you know, why can't we have a national pheasant day? Or maybe that's too upper crusty. Maybe a national shepherd's pie day. You know. So, I mean, what's fascinating to me about this is, first of all, America has always been a multicultural society. We have never been a cohesive society. We have people in America that speak their own forms of English. Really. And British people would say we all speak our own form of English in America. But, you know, look, we have people, I can't understand them. We have a language called Ebonics. We have a gumbo language, fiddle-eye and a gumbo pie and a filet gumbo. For tonight, I'm going to see my Mashera Mio. I mean, do you understand that? I don't understand. It's a Hank Williams song. I mean, he knew what it was about because it's a Louisiana dialect. I don't know what it is. And I'm sure you've got people up in Yorkshire that you can't tell what they're saying. You know, but look, the reality of it is, America, we have people in America driving around in buggies. In buggies. They're debating whether or not to put rubber tires on those buggies. That's what they're debating in their community. And I'm not making this up. America we have places in my state that says, se habla inglés. That means we speak English here. I'm not making this up. We have 7th generation Chinese in San Francisco, Chinatown, that do not speak English. They have been in the United States for 7 generations. This is America. So this idea, this fantasy that some of these British politicians have of bringing this wonderful, cohesive America over here, good luck, my friends. Seriously. But one of the things I love about England is that you've always tolerated eccentric uncles. Why can't you tolerate eccentric religions? Really? I mean, what's so wrong with that? You know, this country was forged in religious wars. Religious and tribal wars to a certain degree. It was forged in that. You learn the lessons of those wars. Britain is one of the most tolerant places in the world. It really is. And like Dorothy Sayers, one of my favorite theologians, she's a mystery writer too, but she was also a good theologian. Dorothy Sayers said, the British people are slow to anger, but when they get angry, they behave like fools. And there's probably a lot of truth in that, but the fact that they are slow to anger, that's one of the most precious virtues in Islamic tradition, hilm, which is the ability to forbear others, to be slow to anger. In terms of what role should governments play in Islamic reform, I mean, I would argue that governments are one of the most important things that Muslim jurists attempted to address was the limits of government. And Muslims traditionally were very libertarian in their approach. They did not like, our jurists did not like, they didn't work for governments, and we had a separation of powers in the sense that the legislative body was in the jurists, and the jurists were independently working. Islamic Sharia arises completely independent of government support. The great jurists were actually Malik, Ahmad ibn Hanbal, Abu Hanifa, Imam Shafi, all spent time in government jails. All of them. And these were the great founders of the Sunni tradition, and the Shia also have a tradition of persecution at the hands of government as well. In some ways far worse than anything the Sunnis ever suffered. So Muslim jurists were always very wary of government. One of the things about that nothing taints a reputation more in our community than an association with a government. You lose your credibility. When I went into the White House, and I was just a guest, they didn't pay me, I didn't get any money. Maybe I should have asked for something because it was just, but that did more to tarnish my reputation amongst a large segment of the Muslim community, because Muslims are very wary of any scholar who associates closely with a government, and they always have been. And there's a reason for that, because governments never do that out of the graciousness of their goodwill. They co-opt. And when George Bush made a reference to "we're not at war with Islam," the CNN camera immediately flashed on me, which made me realize that was pre-planned. So we do have a state press. They called it Pravda in Russia, we call it CNN. But these are the problems that we have to deal with. Now, our Prophet said the worst scholars are those at the doors of rulers, and the best rulers are those at the doors of scholars. My own teacher, Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayya, said the first is restricted, and the second is absolute. What that means in Usuli language is that the first is not an absolute statement, because it's dependent on the intention of the scholar. When the Prophet said the worst scholars are those at the doors of the governments, wanting some personal gain from them. If they go there for the sake of God to advise those governments, then they're not from amongst the worst scholars. This is the type of understanding that needs to translate. Finally, in conclusion, I would argue that some of the most important things that have to take place in the UK and in the United States and really in Europe. We have now 30 million Muslims in Western Europe, according to most statistics. We have probably between 6 to 10 million Muslims in the United States. We have about 3 million Muslims, I think, in Canada, and maybe 2 million in Canada. But we have close to 500,000 in Toronto. They make 10% of the population in Toronto. In Philadelphia, America's first capital, we have 10% Muslims now. In New York City, the Eid the City Council of New York voted to make the Eid holiday a holiday in the city of New York, largely because 12% of Muslim children in the New York City School District are Muslim. 12%, that's the largest city in the United States of America, and 12% of its children in its public school system are Muslim. This is an immense opportunity, but it's also a crisis. And we know that in the Chinese ideogram means both crisis and opportunity. It's a crisis because if we don't somehow come to terms with the fact that Muslims do not have the intellectual tools to navigate their religion in uncharted waters, such as these that we are in now, if these tools are not presented in an intelligent way that's rooted and founded in the Islamic tradition, then we have a very serious problem. And this problem, right now, we're only seeing slight externalities. And I'll use that term externality, as you know, is a negative externality of a corporation is the toxic byproducts that come out of it. So like BP, the positive thing was drilling the well. The negative externality is the fact the well didn't work out. Well, religions have negative externalities as well. Things go wrong. People go wrong. We have Muslims that are negative externalities for the social body. Now, people leave it up to BP to deal with the problem, but sometimes the problem is bigger than BP. Sometimes you do need governments to come in. When the FBI came to me, not to question me, they never came to question me. I mean, they have at the airport and things, but they never came to my house to question me like was reported in the press. And Dr. Ramadan knows about press. I don't believe press anymore, because once you read about yourself in the press, you know it's just rubbish. You know. And Wikipedia, my goodness, you know. So the FBI, I told them, look, my wish, you know, really, my wish is you guys get it right. Really. This is a criminal problem. These are criminals, and they need to be stopped. Extremism is as American as apple pie. We have extreme sports. We jump off buildings, you know, with bungee ropes and things. We have extreme eating. We had a woman die recently in a water drinking contest. We have a hot dog contest where they eat 150 hot dogs. People from Egypt would never do that. You know, we have extreme music. They used our music to torture people at Guantanamo Bay. Seriously, they used it to torture. In fact, the heavy metal bands actually protested against their music being used as torture. We have extremism is as American as apple pie, really. The problem is not extremism. Extremism is a human problem, but it's always been there. It will always be there. The problem is violence in a civil society. And this is what we need to address, the problem of violence. And at essence, Islam is an Iranic religion. It is a peaceful tradition. Our Prophet was not a warmonger. He did not like war. He disdained war. He said, never hope to meet your enemies, but if you're forced to meet them, be brave in the battlefield. He prohibited the killing of civilians. He prohibited the killing of women and children. In the Maliki fiqh that I studied, the only time that you can fight a woman if she's a combatant on the other side. The Maliki jurists were so troubled by the hadith that they said, if you see a woman on the battlefield, run away from her. Because they did not want you to fall under that hadith, because it's a mutawatir hadith, it's a factual hadith that has the same strength as a verse in the Quran. Now, I want to close and end this by saying one of the greatest problems we have is we have what I call Sheikh Googles, weekend muftis. We have now a loss of authority in our tradition. This has led to people like what they call Sheikh bin Laden. Somebody called me up on a recent Arabic program and said, what do you think of Sheikh Osama bin Laden? And I just said, first of all, what do you want from the question? Do you want me to be, if I answer, oh, he's a great guy, to be in Guantanamo Bay tomorrow? I mean, is that kind of the idea? Or what, you want, you know, I think he's terrible. But who made him a sheikh? Really, who made Sheikh Osama bin Laden a sheikh? Osama bin Laden is an accountant. Ayman Zawahiri was a pediatric surgeon. And these people are giving fatwa from caves in Afghanistan telling people to kill people. Now, their fatwa is based on a famous fatwa from Mardin. The fatwa that killed Anwar Sadat is the same fatwa. My sheikh and teacher, Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayya, recently held a conference in Turkey in the city of Mardin, which is where the fatwa was addressing an issue in that city. The fact that the ruler of that city was a Muslim but not applying Islamic law, and he was under the influence of the Mughals who were not Muslim at that time. He was asked, is this an abode of war or an abode of peace? He said, it's neither one or the other. It's a hybrid, because it doesn't have the qualities of the abode of war, it doesn't have the qualities of the abode of peace. And then he said something very interesting. He said, therefore, the believer should be treated in accordance with the fact that he's a believer, and the disbeliever should be fought. يُقَاتِلُ الْخَارِجُ عَنِ الشَّرِيعَةِ بِمَا يَسْتَحِقُ. The disbeliever should be fought because he's left the Sharia and as he deserves to be. Now, Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayya, when that fatwa was read in Mardin, he said that can't be right, the text. The ulama that were in the audience, some of them, some of the biggest ulama in the Muslim world, all said, Sheikh, don't change the fatwa. It's Sheikh al-Islam's fatwa. We can address the problems of the fatwa, but don't change the text of the fatwa. Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayya insisted. He said, no, something is wrong with that text. It doesn't work in the Arabic language like that. When he got back to Jeddah, he went to another text and found that it did not say that the one who left the Sharia should be fought. It actually said, instead of yuqatilu, it said yu'amalu. He should be treated in accordance with him being a disbeliever. In other words, there are many rules that relate to disbelievers. Then he asked for the oldest copy in the Zahiriya Mektaba in Damascus, and it came back saying, in fact, that he should be treated, not killed or fought. That fatwa was published 100 years ago and has been replicated in countless editions of his fatwas saying that they should be fought. That is the basis of Abdul Salam Faraj's fatwa to kill Anwar Sadat. It was the basis of bin Laden's fatwa to kill the Americans and also to overthrow the House of Saud in Saudi Arabia. It's a misprint. They've based an entire philosophy on a misprint in a text that occurred 100 years ago. This is a crisis in our community, the crisis of authority. Who can read these texts and who can determine what they mean? Thank you very much.
I just want to start by thanking the Oxford University Islamic Society for this evening. I think that all of us here, we should and we must thank you for what you have been doing and being able to just bring Sheikh Hamza Yusuf here in this country, in this city. He has been ill for the last few days, so thank you for being here, but thank you, students, for doing the job. So let me come to this discussion, because I really think that here we are dealing with something which is a very serious issue. And as you will see, we may have some common ideas and disagreements on some of the topics and the issues, but I think that this is where Muslims around the world should come to a deep understanding and to open channels for intra-community discussions that are missing today and not done at the level which is needed. In fact, you know, when I went to Egypt to study, because it was not possible, and I think also that the future of Western Muslims to have institutions in the West, but I went to Egypt and I was with scholars, and in fact there is something common in our journey to Islamic knowledge, is that born and raised in the West and going back to Egypt, for example, it was in Egypt for me, I went to traditional one-to-one courses with scholars, and just what I wanted is just to get the knowledge and what we call in the traditional way of teaching ijazat, and this is what I wanted from the scholars. But there is one thing that I asked to one of the scholars, who is a very important scholar in Egypt, Sheikh al-Aqabawi, and I was with him and said, you know what I want to do in the fiqh field? I want to study mawdi' al-ikhtilaf. So what are the issues where the scholars did not agree? I want to understand why. What is the point? And we went through 60 issues on which the scholars are coming from the Sunni tradition, the Shia tradition, and within the Sunni tradition, the Shafi'i, al-Hanbali, al-Maliki, and others. And I wanted to understand how and why. Why first and how they were disagreeing and how they were dealing with the text. Why? Because there is something which is not disputable among the Muslim scholars and among the Muslims, is that the text is the text and the Quran is the Quran. But we agree that there are many interpretations. So from the text, which is one text, there are many interpretations dealing with minds, environments, time, space, and that you have to take this into account if you want to understand. And the main point, which was very, very important for me, is that while I was studying at the same time with one scholar fiqh and with the other scholar usul al-fiqh, the point was very clear that if you take what is in usul al-fiqh, as Shatibi was saying, 14th century, he was saying something which was quite important, which is in fact usul al-fiqh, the fundamentals of law and jurisprudence, are in fact the philosophy of law, the Islamic philosophy of law, which is behind the scene, which is the old framework within which we think about fiqh. And then you come to all these scholars that are disagreeing, and you understand something which is quite important. In fact, they were not reading the same way, but they had the same intention. And the intention was, how am I the more faithful to the very essence of the text? Not only in the way I read it, but in the objectives. What I want to achieve out of my reading. It's all about the same intention. So this is something which is important, because if now we are speaking about reform, we have to ask ourselves, what are our intentions? Are we trying to be more faithful or still faithful? Or do we want only to adapt to a changing world, forgetting sometimes the very essence of our religion? So intention here is essential. So there is something which is common ground, that behind the scene, all the scholars, if we accept and agree, and this was my position from the very beginning in this vast tradition, as Hamza Yusuf was saying, is something which is quite important, is that it is sincere scholars are trying to be faithful. And there are many ways of being faithful, depending on your understanding, your minds, because sometimes you can be sharp and sometimes you can be superficial. But to try to be faithful when your mind could be superficial is still sincerity, that you have to acknowledge this. So here there is something which is the starting point of the discussion for me. And then the point was not only, as it was said, because when I wrote the book, Radical Reform, Islamic Ethics and Liberation, I got some, remarks and feedbacks coming from Muslims saying, oh, this is a Western viewpoint. I say, no, I'm sorry. It's not at all a Western viewpoint. It's for Muslims living today. It's for contemporary Muslims facing the challenges of their time, in the West as well as in Muslim-majority countries. So how do we deal with contemporary challenges, and how are we going to deal with them and try to find solution in that field? And then this is where you get something which is important. You can spend hours and years and a life studying the scholars and the way they were dealing with the texts, and say, okay, at the end of the day, we must say something, which is, in the vast Islamic tradition, the scholars agreed not to agree, and that there are many interpretations, and that's it. There is an accepted diversity in Islam. And then you stop here, and you have to deal with literalists, the Salafiyya al-Harfiyya, the literalist Salafi, or the traditionalists that are following a very specific schools of law, or the reformist, or the Sufi, and that's it. But if you want to face up to the challenges of today, you may have to question the methodology. And the methodology is exactly what I went through, because I was focusing on, for 20 years, even when I was dealing with contemporary challenges in the West, but not only in Muslim-majority countries, when we speak about, the political system, or economic, even spirituality in Muslim-majority countries, because it's not as easy as it appears. And then people are saying it's easier to be a Muslim in Muslim-majority countries. It could be because you are listening to the call of prayers, but deep down, when we speak about spirituality, something which is the essence of life, it's not easy. In our contemporary life, spiritual faithfulness, it's very difficult. It's a challenge, wherever we live, in the West or in Muslim-majority countries. So the point here is, how do we deal with this, and how are we going to challenge that and understand in which way we can solve these problems and the crisis that we are facing? And then I came to something which is an inductive process, from the fiqh field to something which is the fundamentals of fiqh, usul al-fiqh, by saying this is maybe where we have to come back, and to come back to the essential. Because the fiqh dimension is very important, and it's quite clear, and this is true, that many Muslims today, they don't know about the vast, tradition of Islam with so many different, opinions coming from scholars on very specific issues. Some are dealing with prayers, but about, women, about the way we are dealing with the environment, with culture, with music. There are lots of fatwa, legal opinions, that we are not considering because we don't know. We are not coming back to this. But is this enough? Is it enough to come back to the tradition to say we have so many opinions in specific issues? Is this going to help us to solve the crisis and the problems? My position is inductively to say no, we need more than that. And this is where I was coming with something which I call the radical reform, but not to adapt to the West, but as something which is intrinsic to the Islamic tradition, that we have to come back to the fundamentals and ask ourselves, are we doing the job? Are we facing the challenges? And then more importantly even, my statement here, and my position is to say that it may be that if Muslims are coming back to this, there could be a contributive force and a contribution not only for themselves, but to the contemporary world, by asking new questions and being more creative and coming back. So it's not because we are scared we come back to ourselves, but we come to ourselves because it's a necessity, and then we are contributing to the debates that we have on many issues. So let me come to this, because this is where I think we are dealing with the philosophy of law. And this is, for me, to come to the concept of reform. First, because once again, we have to be quite clear, I'm not talking about reforming Islam, because Islam is not to be reformed, and this is something which is, for me, not the right way to put the question and to put the understanding of the framework, is to reform the Muslim minds and the Muslim understandings of the texts. So the point here is reforming, and this is why I may disagree with the concept of renovation only, because I'm not touching Islam, I'm touching the minds, I'm touching the intellects, I'm touching the understandings. This is where we need something. Why? Because in the hadith of the Prophet, peace be upon him, he's speaking about people corrupting. Fasadaha. Who? The man, people. Not religion is not going to be corrupt in itself. So we are talking about reforming the minds and not touching the essence of the religion. And this is something which is quite important, and this is also the concept of Islah as being understood as such. Second thing which is also important, and this is also what was said by Sheikh Hamza Yusuf, and it's important, we are not talking about reforming everything. There are things in Islam that are the essence of this religion if the thawabit are not going to change. And it's even more than the 6 pillars of Iman. Arkan al-Iman, it's more than that. It's even something which is very important when it comes to Buni al-Islam ala khamsin, meaning the pillars of Islam. We are going to change that. This is not to be changed. This is something to be respected. This is the essence. And then the prohibitions and the duties are not going to change. Now, of course, some are going to be adapted in a question of prioritizing them depending on what is essential and what is secondary. But the prohibitions and the duties and the principles are not going to change. So min al-thawabit, we are not talking about this, we are talking about al-mutaghayyirat, which are the changeable dimension, and this is something, once again, which is so important in this discussion. So, having in mind that, in fact, what is behind the whole discussion, and this is for me quite important here. When am I talking about reform, and I will come to the terminology because it's essential. You cannot come to this understanding if you don't understand the very essence of some of the Islamic words and concepts. Here there is something which is, for me, the starting point of the discussion. I'm talking about reforming. I'm talking about reforming the Muslim minds with one intention, is how today are we going to remain faithful to this, to the principles of Islam and to this religion? It's a question of faithfulness. Am I faithful if I'm promoting a status quo? Or am I faithful when I'm pushing the people to rethink their understanding of the text, because times are changing and flying and spaces are also changing and cultures and environments. We have to deal with this. So the point here is the intention. The intention is faithfulness. And this is a very important point. The objective is, am I going to be faithful to the very essence of this religion today? And faithfulness is difficult. Faithfulness means that it's not only faithfulness with your heart, it's faithfulness with your mind, it's with faithfulness with your actions within your societies and individually and collectively in the society as a community. So here, the point for me is really to come to this, and this is why I understand that some Muslims, and even in the West, when, for example, I was talking about reform, say, don't use this word, it's coming from Christianity. I said, look, I understand why you are saying this, and we are just saying this with Sheikh Hamza Yusuf before we were talking here, but there is something for me which is quite important. I can understand that sometimes we don't want concepts coming from outside being imposed onto us. The point is it true with the concept of reform and some of the concepts that we have from the Arabic tradition and from even the ahadith and the Quran, Quranic verses that we have to deal with? Because it's true that sometimes if you think of yourself through the eyes of the others, you are alienated. This is the very meaning of alienation. But I would say that in time of fear, there is a double alienation which is much more dangerous, which you think that you think through the eyes of the other because you are disconnected or you are scared of coming back to the true essence of your religion. So by not knowing yourself, you think that you think through the eyes of the other. So this is double alienation, and it's very dangerous. So let us come back to the very essence of some of the Islamic concepts here. And I'm not only using one to speak about reform, I'm using three. The first one, yes, is Islah, because it's in the verse and it's everywhere in the Quran. And even more than that, there is something which is quite important with the concept of reform, is that you yourself, if you don't care of yourself, if you are unjust with your own body, your own heart, your own mind, you can corrupt yourself. So Islah al-Nafs is something which is an ongoing process of reforming yourself to come to the better, to come back to a sound state, which is a very important point. This is a very important concept here when it comes to Islam, but there is another one, which is coming from the prophetic tradition, which is tajdeed, which is to renew. Allahu yab'athu li hadhihi al-umma ala ra'si kulli mi'atin sana man yujaddidu laha dinaha, meaning by this that every century we'll have someone or a group of people coming to help this community to renew its religion. And renewal here, its tajdeed, is something which is important. What does it mean? All the scholars who came or quoted this hadith, this prophetic tradition, were saying, we are not talking about changing the religion, we are talking about renewing your understanding. So, tajdeed al-fahm, which is a new understanding of the text. So the text is not going to change. Your mind is changing because the time is changing, and the environment is changing. Of course, you have you are thinking out of a specific context and you read the text in a specific way. But this is even the case with any text with your own self. When you are sad, you read the text in another way. When you are full of joy because the text is talking in another way because you are reading something else. You are projecting onto the text. But it happens also with intellect. It happens also with minds. It happens also because the challenges are new. And there is another one, which is Ihya, which is the one Abu Hamid al-Ghazali was using, Ihya ulum ad-din, which is we have to come back to give a new life and to revival, which is also important. So it's revival of our minds, of our understanding in the sciences. The sciences is the product of the human intellect as to the way we deal with knowledge, the knowledge of the texts. So Ihya, Tajdid, wa Islah. And I would say that this is intrinsic to the Islamic tradition, that we have to go through this if we want to be faithful. There is no way to be faithful to universal principles if you don't understand the historical contexts and environments. No, please. Don't clap. It disturbs me and I don't like it. So this is something which is important. So let me come with this understanding now to terminologies. So this is one concept which is important here, and then it helps us to understand two other concepts. When it comes to not the specialized way some scholars were dealing with some concept, you have to be very careful. Because if you go to fuqaha, by definition a faqih is dealing with law, with rules, with ahkam. So when he comes to understand the very meaning of Sharia, for him Sharia will be this framework within which he is going to think about the law. And some of them were talking about Islamic law. This is Sharia. But in fact, the very essence of the word, the way towards the source, is in fact the very essence of it. And this is why I don't agree with this very classical categorization between, oh, there is the way of the Sufi and there is the way of the jurist. So Sharia is for the jurist, and for the Sufi there is something which is completely different. No, the heart of Sharia is the Sufi spiritual tradition. It's not something which is separate. It's within. It's within. Why? Because in fact, the very meaning of Sharia is the way towards faithfulness. So you get it now. The intention at the beginning is how we are going to be faithful. Sharia is a construct which is scholars trying to get the rules, trying to get the framework with your heart, with your mind, within your society, individually or within a community, to remain faithful to the essence of your religion. This is the Sharia. So it's the way towards faithfulness. On our way to implement this in our heart, تطبيق الشريعة في قلبك, meaning the Sharia in your heart and in your life and in your family and everywhere, when you try to be faithful to this essence, there is something which you have to struggle, to strive. What is the word that we are using? Jihad. There is no way to be faithful if you are not going towards jihad. And jihad is to strive to do what, in fact? To resist what is bad in you, to resist what is bad around you, to do what? To reform it for the better. So the very meaning of jihad has nothing to do with holy war. It has nothing to do only with the concept of effort. The very meaning of jihad is to resist in order to reform. It's a two-way process. You resist. Al-amr bil-ma'ruf wal-nahy an al-munkar, meaning that you have al-munkar, you resist al-munkar, which is the bad thing, and then you try to reform it for the better. So this process is in fact the way you are going to reform yourself. You reform yourself by resisting the bad and going, why I'm coming to this deep understanding? Because there is a connection between the way you deal with yourself and the way you are going to deal with the world and to reform your understanding. So let me, with this, these are three words that I wanted to come back to in order to understand the whole dimension and to answer the questions. So here we are with this, trying to renew our understanding, to look at the text, to try to understand the very essence of the text and the principles in the light of our specific context, and to try to understand how we are going to renew our understanding because we are around us challenges that are completely new. So sometimes all sound answers to old problems are not sound answers for new problems. And it might be that you are going to betray the very essence of the text if you literally implement one verse in a new specific environment, because it doesn't fit. It's not the right way. You have to reinterpret, understand. Sometimes some of the dimensions of the text and the verses and the prophetic traditions were not reached at the time people were dealing with them because they had specific understanding. So here we are coming to something which is from the very beginning very important, and for me today, the essence of this discussion and the heart of the discussion is the dialectical process to which we have to go. And once again, it's not new, but it might be that we have a problem of methodology. It's the dialectical process. We read the verses, we try to understand in which specific contexts these verses were revealed. So there is a dialectical process between the environment and the text. Some of the texts are beyond the context, as we said, they are immutable, and some others are to be connected with a specific context. And then you come to your own context, your own environment, and you try to understand in which way you are going to implement this text for today. So this is what the fuqaha are doing. This is the legal field. But there is something which was implicit in all the traditions, and even beyond we had these schools of law, is to be able to come with a new understanding and to implement in the right way the text, you need to know the environment. So the knowledge of the environment was implicitly everywhere. Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyya in I'lam al-Muwaqqi'in, when he is giving all the conditions to me a mujtahid, halat al-nas is something which is important. You need to know how the people are living and where they are living to be able to implement. If you don't know, it means that your knowledge of the text is partial. You don't get it all. You need to know what the people are experiencing. And if you live in any Muslim majority countries or in the West, you need to know this knowledge. This is part of being a mujtahid and a mufti. A mufti needs to know where the people and what the people are experiencing. If not, you're just coming with the text and you don't understand what the people are experiencing in their daily life. So there is something which is important here, is not only we need to get a good understanding, but there is something also which is quite important, is to get a critical understanding of the environment. And a critical understanding of the environment, it's important. Why? Because you need to know what are the pressure that the people are facing. Because today I have people coming to me telling me, oh, we need a reform, and the way they ask the question is quite clear that they are under the pressure of the surrounding society. They are not coming with the intention of faithfulness, they are coming with the intention to please power or dominant culture, the world. I say this is the way to be open-minded. So question your intention. What do you want? And this is something which is important. When you are in our situation, in the Muslim majority countries as well as in the West, you cannot just come and say, oh, it's a neutral question. I don't get it. There is no neutral questions. If you come and you work for a government and you come with a specific question, ask your intention. Who do you want to please? Because some government, as it was said, I haven't seen a government giving money, not only in the West, but in Muslim majority countries, they give money, they have a specific intention. So some Muslims here, and this is part of our environment. It's very important for us living in the West to know that some of our leaders, Muslims, they are so much under pressure that they are coming with the concept of reform which has nothing to do with faithfulness, which has to do with pleasing. And sometimes pleasing the Muslims because there is a state of fear. So it's a very, very important point here. So this is why we should never have scholars today working for a specific government, here or there. Never. Why? Because you are playing at a very, very dangerous. Very dangerous. So what I'm saying here, by saying never, is, once again, and I think that the point was very important here, question the intention of the scholar, because sometimes in a specific issue it's quite important to be close to the rulers, to be able to be critical, to be able to help them to be critical and to understand that. So, once again, not to be used by governments, and not only in our societies, in the West, in Muslim majority countries, not to take into account this pressure coming from the environment could be very dangerous. This is why scholars are people coming from within. They should be very clear on knowing the text, knowing the environment, but the atmosphere, the environment, the psychological dimension of the fatwa. And this is what I wrote in the foreword of the European Council. I said, be careful. It's a very good first step, but be careful. We're not dealing only with legal opinion. Legal opinions are dealing with psychology. And you have to take psychology into account when you deliver a fatwa. Because the pressure around you could be so strong that the psychological atmosphere could just distort the very essence of the fatwa when the people are taking it out of fear. It's a very important point. The psychology of the fatwa, the pedagogy of the fatwa in the context should be taken into. So this is why it's not simple. It's a very complex issue. So when I'm talking about the context, I'm not only talking about the knowledge of the context. When, for example, the African-American Muslims, the first with whom I was in touch before coming with the immigrant, when they were saying, the problem that we have with immigrant Muslims, the people who came thinking that the American dream was great, this is a problem that they don't understand the logic, the system, the domination from within. They don't know what it means to be a black Muslims in this country. So they come with something which is, let us be nice. They don't understand power. They want to forget this. But how are you going to be faithful to the text if you don't get that? You don't get that you are talking with people with power and you are powerless. Or sometimes you have the power of the powerless, which is great, which is very important. So here there is something which is this dimension is important when you speak about reform, which is not to take this as something which is very simple. It's a very deep discussion here that we need also to tackle. So very quickly on that. When I come to this, there is something which is important, and this was my starting point when I was starting to deal, inductively, 20 years dealing with fiqh, having these scholars who was helping me so much to be very cautious with, the rules, saying this is the way, so to adapt the fatwa to the environment. And this was very important. And in the book that I wrote for, the Muslims in Muslim-majority countries, Islam, the West, and the Challenges of Modernity, and the other book on Western Muslims, this was the step-by-step, working in the fiqh, the legal dimension and legal opinions. And then I was reaching some limits. I said, there is something, that's fine, but there is something which is a problem. All my work is ending up, while I'm not happy with the state of the world, I'm not happy. If you are, I wouldn't say that there is any Christian, Jew, humanist, anyone who can be happy with the state of the world. We have to reform it. It has to be more, we need more justice, more dignity. We need to be involved in something which is transforming the world for the better. And all my work is adapting. And when I was dealing with some scholars, the two main words that we have, al-haja wa darura. Al-haja is it's a need, al-darura is a necessity. So let us, because it's a state of necessity, we'll come with a legal opinion helping us to deal with this necessity. We cannot choose. I said, I don't understand the way towards faithfulness to adapt to the world, the state, in the state of affairs that we have now, without thinking of changing it. My contribution is not to accept, but to change, to transform. And I came back to something which is essential. If you come and you get to what we were talking about first, Islah al-Nafs, reforming your own self, there is something which is very important in the whole process, is that not only you need to know the principles, not only you need to know the objectives, you need to know the principles of Islam. These are the pillars. This is what you need to respect because this is coming from God. But you need the objectives. What you need to do is to be even more just with your own self. This is why one of our prayers and supplications is, Allahumma zalamna anfusana. We have been unjust towards our own self. So it's just to be just with your own self. So to reform ourselves is to be more just with our own self. But you need this knowledge, but there is one knowledge which is necessary. It's the knowledge of yourself. How are you going? Because the same verses and the same prophetic traditions are not going to play the same role with every one of us. This is the knowledge of the self. So in fact, to reform yourself, you need two knowledges, the principles and the knowledge of the self. You need to know your own weaknesses. You need to get this, so something which is universal in all the philosophies, know yourself. So Islah al-Nafs wal-Muraqaba, meaning that you are looking at yourself, watching yourself, means I'm trying to know myself and to change. So the very spiritual understanding, and very often it's quite important to come back to these spiritual teachings to understand the function and the way we have to deal with rules, is really to come to this essence. It's exactly what I did with jihad, to understand it from within, from the spiritual dimension, to understand what it means with your society. It's exactly the same with reforming. You need two knowledges: the knowledge of the rules, the knowledge of the objectives, and the knowledge of the self. So now come to something which is that we not only want to reform ourselves, what we want is to reform the world in the name of faithfulness, to be faithful. Is it then possible just to come with scholars of the texts that are coming with the principles and the rules if we don't get the other knowledge, which is the knowledge of the context at the level which is necessary to transform? Because if you only go through the legal dimension, and this is what we are doing now, and this is why I think that we are facing a deep crisis, not only a crisis of authority, because I think it's a critical question, but a crisis of methodology, that the way we are dealing with the surrounding world, if you only come with the text and you try to catch up, to adapt, at the end of the day, by definition, anything which has to do with rules is meant to adapt to what it is, to what the state of affairs is. By definition, if you come with, this is the work of the jurist. Jurisprudence is just to change your rules and laws to adapt to the state of affairs. So you're not changing, you are adapting. And for 20 years, I've been talking and dealing with scholars who are talking and using the same word of islah, wa tajdid, but we didn't mean the same thing. For some, it was adaptational reform. We adapt. And my take on this is there is only one way to be faithful, is a transformational reform. We need to transform. As much as I have to transform myself for the better, as much as I need to transform the world for the better. So I'm not talking about the immutable principles, I'm talking about some of the main things that we have to go. And this is why the point for me was really to come to usul al-fiqh and to say this is where we have to work. So quite quickly here, it's the double knowledge is to try to reach our objectives. And once again, the objectives that we have. And this is why I came back to the usul al-fiqh, which is the fundamentals. And in the book, Radical Reform, in the first part, I'm just coming to the tradition, this vast tradition, all the schools that were dealing with usul al-fiqh, from al-Juwayni to al-Ghazali, and then to al-Shatibi, 14th century, and the first one, 11th century. During these 4 centuries, they were trying to work on a framework. And what they were saying is, implicitly, they are always referring to the surrounding society in the schools that we had, usul al-fiqh from al-Shafi'i before, from the inductive process that we had in the Hanafi schools of law. And then you have Madrasat al-Maqasid, thinking about the objectives. And when you think about this, what they are trying to do is to think about what are the objectives that we want to reach. And having this in mind, they came with the 6 principles that are known. In fact, there are 5, and Qarafi added another one, which is al-ird, which is dignity, but you have, protection of the deen, which is religion, and your aql, intellect, and nas, the progeny, it's al-amwal, your goods, and also the intellect. So those are 5, and then out of this, some added others. So this is a long tradition, it's not new. But my position on this is to say the fundamental here, they were dealing with the scriptural sources and implicitly saying that we need to deal with the context. And the people who were the most effective are in fact coming from the Maliki school of law. So the one that Sheikh Hamza was studying. And it's quite important. Why? Because from the very beginning they had something which was al-masalih al-mursala, that there are some issues on which Allah remained silent, and that the people have to deal with them and to come with an understanding of the challenges and coming with understanding and trying to find their way. So they were dealing with the context which was implicitly everywhere. So from this situation, the fiqh, to the usul al-fiqh, questioning the objective al-maqasid and trying to come with a better understanding. Saying what, in fact? That today what we have is the authority of the scholars of the text coming and telling us about ethics and applied ethics. And they're trying to catch up with contemporary sciences and knowledge. But by doing this, the only answers that we have are adaptation to the state of affairs. And even the alternative are within the system. Let me give you an example. Many scholars and many were very happy in this crisis, the economic crisis, were saying, look, what we have now is we have an alternative Islamic model in economy, which is called Islamic economy or Islamic finance. And if we look at what is done in Islamic finance now, it's what I'm always saying, it's a window in the whole system with what is called, Sharia compliant, system within. And if you look at it, many economists are saying it's not going to solve our problems. It's just a window within the whole global system. But think about it. What is happening today is that we are not coming with ethics and vision for the future to challenge the economic order with a new vision. We are just adapting within the system a window, and by adapting, in fact, if you think about it, you confirm the whole system. It's just you making a window of halal in an ocean of haram. And this is something which is this what we have to do? This is the only way to be faithful? Some Muslims are saying, yes, but we are protecting ourselves. That's fine, but to protect as a step is good. To protect as an end is wrong. We're not going to change. We're not creative in economy if we don't come with other views. So this is where we need something which is scholars of the text and scholars of the context in the environment to come together and to think about an applied ethics. So some of the scholars are telling me, we are doing this. The problem is that in our councils of Islamic scholars, very often they're asking reports and papers coming from specialists in economy, specialists in medicine. The only field within which something very deep is done now is in medicine. In medicine, it's the highest level. When you have medical doctors sitting with scholars in Muslim majority countries and they are coming in very, very efficient fatwa and legal opinions in very specific and up-to-date issues. They are very doing well. But in many other fields, there is a disconnect. They are not working together. It's just, we are the ulama and you are the specialist, al-khubara. And then there is a level here, which is we think about the text and you come with these sciences. It's as if these sciences are secondary sciences. And I think that this is wrong. It was never like this from the very beginning. That we need an applied ethics, and to get this applied ethics, we need to have together the two knowledges. The knowledges of the text and the knowledges of the environment, of the context. In order not only to adapt, but to have a vision for the future to transform and not only to reform under the pressure sometimes of the dominant culture. So this is something which is the methodology which is to be questioned. And this is what I call shifting the center of gravity of authority in Islam. The religious and the legal authority is that we need now people in many fields that they are knowledgeable about. Because the scholars, they know that they don't know about medicine. Because it's about death and life. So they are asking the medical doctors, give us the knowledge that we need to be able to come with a fatwa. For example, in the brain death, they need the scholars and the medical doctors to come at that level. But in many issues, when it comes to society, when it comes to the relationship between power, it's as if we know all about it. So we are under the pressure. That's wrong. Human sciences, we need scholars coming from that field. In economy, we need that. In anything which has to do with arts and creativity. It's not just entertainment. Arts today is something which is deep, and it has to do also all the media, for example. It's a science. You need to deal with psychology, so you are not only coming with, oh, we have something which is protecting ourselves with some rules that is halal and that is haram. So are we going to contribute or not in these fields? So this is where I think that we need to have what I call the radical reform from the methodology to coming to some of these principles and objectives. I think that today the 6 objectives, that we had are not enough. Ibn Taymiyyah was the first one to come to add, we need a spiritual dimension, so there are objectives that are spiritual. So he was critical on something which was not only the objectives for the society, but the objectives for yourself. And then we also need objectives when it comes to our societies as communities. We need to add objectives and principles to what was done by scholars in the Middle Ages. What they did was fine, but we need to add this. Why? Because our sciences and the world today is more complex than this. We just come and say, you have to protect your religion, you have to protect your intellect. How come am I going to protect my intellect when so many powerful means can just change me and push me not to vote with my mind, but to vote with my emotions? We are dealing in a time of emotional politics. And then we have to come with something which is deep on that. So this is where I think that these are important discussions. So let me end by saying that this is what I was trying to do in the book. It's to come with a new framework of applied ethics and objectives for our time, not only in the West, but in Muslim majority countries, and to come to something which is calling the scholars not to be closer to the power and the governments, but closer to the people, and the people to be closer to the scholars, to have this ongoing dialogue where we are losing such, authorities within the community that are people that are knowledgeable, they know in their field. It's as if when it comes to Islam, they are childish. It's just they are coming to something, oh, I don't know about Islam. Experts in their field, but not being able to say anything about, what could be my Islamic contribution or my contribution in the realm of the Islamic ethics. So this, I think it's this which is quite important here. And from this adaptation reform to transformation reform, and this shifting the center of gravity of authority in Islam, and by pushing the people, how can we do this? Is really by pushing this council that we have with scholars that are coming from different fields together, and to be able to think together about some of the issues of our time. And it started in some areas, as I said, we have now some of these councils, but I wouldn't say that, as I heard from some scholars, even great scholars of our time saying, oh, we are trying to do this, but when you ask them about how are you going to set this, it's not done at that level. Islamic applied ethics needs something which is new as to how do we deal with the knowledge of the text and the knowledge of the context. And I have no hesitation to speak about ulama al-nusus wa ulama al-waqa'. At the same level, there is something which is they have to work together and they have to come with something which is a better understanding. Of course, as to the knowledge of the text, we are dealing with scholars that they know the text, but it's quite clear that you cannot today have the same knowledge of the text and the same knowledge of the context in any field. It's not possible. It's too complex. So by doing this and by coming with this, I don't want to just accept something which has to do with the pressure of the surrounding society that, oh, there are some issues and you have to come to these questions and to respond to these questions. For example, some of the, the question of that are dealing with specific issues is the only way to show that you are moderate Muslims is to respond to that. Let us come to some of these principles in a way where we have to be quite critical and to promote something which is a better understanding of our world. I don't want anything which has to do with isolation, because I think that isolation is once again not to contribute, or assimilation, which is just to lose your soul and to be lost in the world. It's really about this critical thinking and what we can promote. So this is where I would like the Muslims of today, in Muslim majority countries as well as here, and this is why also I'm saying that the Western Muslims have a great deal of responsibility in the whole process, because we have access to education. It's possible for us to be critical and to come with also deeper understanding, and to be also in a dialogue with Muslim scholars and people in Muslim majority countries. But when it comes to our contribution to how are we going to deal with contemporary issues on consumerism, for example, to be able as Muslims to come with something which is an ethical take on anything which has to do with the global order, on consumerism, on something which is central. I don't, once again, from where I am, just to follow in the footsteps of the dominant culture and not to ask the question, for example, within our societies about family. How are we going to think about family and transmission of knowledge and values and something which is central in the Islamic tradition? So it's not to dilute everything in our contemporary discussion and say, okay, we are only concerned with the headscarf, are only concerned with terrorism. No, there are deep questions here when we need to contribute. Of course, we have to respond to violence. We have to respond to some of these issues. We need to do that. And very often, when you look at what is happening now on, violent extremism, the Muslims said what they have to say, and they are condemning it, and we have to continue this work. But once again, it's not only to be on the defensive by just following on what is asked. Okay, we need to speak about this, we speak about violence, we speak about the headscarf, we speak about homosexuality. We have deeper concerns. This is where we are contributing to the world. This is where we are also asking ourselves, in our societies today, we speak about democracy, that's fine, but what about these populists? What about these media that are pushing the people to follow, emotional politics and to follow things that are very dangerous? In the United States of America, 53% of the people are supporting the coming back of torture. This is unacceptable. So this is our contribution to come to say, we are dealing with what we want is more education, the critical mind. This is where the Muslims are coming with an applied ethics to contribute to the international discussion, not only to be on the defensive when it comes to the global warming, when it comes to respecting the creation, when it comes to also working against corruption, against prostitution, against anything which has to do today with trafficking and what we have, new slavery. Even in Europe, we live in a continent when you have new slavery here. And we are patronizing about, no, we have to come with this discussion. So I don't want, once again, to come with something which has to do with reforming our thinking only on very secondary issues. It's deeper than that. It's something which is our big contribution on the media, on the democratization process, on anything which has to do with the mass culture, and also something which is important for me. It's very important for me, which is something which is has not to do with rules, it has to do with dignity, and it has to do with art, for example. Where are the Muslims today? Only rejecting the mass culture, the entertainment culture, what, for example, Umberto Eco is saying is the carnavalization of the world, and we are critical towards this. But what are we proposing? What are the Muslims on the ethical ground proposing on something which is a dignified way of dealing with arts, with expression, with coming us with this? Don't we have the assets? Don't we have this power to come to reform our understanding, to promote something which is a new understanding on this? This is what I would expect from Muslims today, not only to come back to the tradition who said we had all the answers. That's not true. We have lots of answers, but there are unanswered challenges that we have to face today. Thank you.
So we're going to launch straight into the question and answer session. We're first going to take our questions from the floor. If you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand, and one of the stewards will come to you with a microphone. So do we have any questions on the floor? Can we have the gentleman here, please?
Hello, assalamu alaikum. Dr. Shihab Jamjoom from Saudi Arabia. These questions to Mr. Ramadan. Well, I like what you said, but we need plan. All what you said is very good, but what is the plan to do all this, to face the challenges and to teach the world all what you said about ethics and about, so we need a plan, just to not to talk more and more. So I hope that you have something to offer in the plan.
Yes, I think that, I think that many things are already done in some fields. For example, I will take the example, as I said, in medicine, that these councils where scholars, Muslim scholars of the text with medical doctors are working together, and they are able to come with very interesting things on euthanasia, on cloning and all that. What I would like, and I think that we have to open up and to be more effective on this, and this is what I want to translate into, with councils where we are able to come with scholars that are dealing with the text, but more specialized, issues. And for example, some of the economists. And once again, on the knowledge of the world, we need sometimes people who are not Muslims, who are coming and sitting, and they can come with this, for example, in economy, and when it comes to from the East and from the West, and sitting together. So I would say that we have to go a step further now. It's really time for us to call not upon the scholars to do the job, but also to the Muslim communities. Don't blame the authority when you are not playing the game. You are not accountable, and you don't understand in which way you have, because we have lots of people in many fields, for example, in education. That's very good to think about, Islamic schools, and okay, that's fine. Do you think that over the last 30 years, for example, the Islamic schools are doing much better now than they did before? They are improving. But we need much more than that now when we deal with, acquisition of knowledge, and how do we deal with the surrounding world in Muslim majority countries as well as here. So we need to have things on this, where the Muslim scholars should be involved in this discussion. I think that the halal and haram business was something which is far from. Now we live in a very complex world. Education is a very complex challenge now. So in economy, about women, for example. About women. I'm sorry, you cannot just, as Muslim scholars, sit men together and ask for the women to give you a report on the situation of women and say, okay, we are going to change the situation. So in many things, we have to come back to the traditions, because many things are done today that are not respecting the Islamic tradition from the very beginning. Even in our mosques, there are things that are unacceptable, not because, we are not dealing with the challenges of today, but we are not respecting what is the Islamic tradition on first hand. This is one. But no. The second thing, it's really to have scholars and women coming also with this knowledge in our circles, where they can come with this and also understand things that are, when the people are telling you, this is something which is, we are very much integrating in the West, and you can show the people that are very much integrating with the rates of divorces. This is where we are the best. We are coming very close to what is happening in the surrounding society. But many Muslims are saying, yes, it means that you are lost here. In the Muslim majority countries, we don't have so many divorces. Ask yourself why. Is it because it's better? Any one of us who is just serious about the issue is just knowing that what is going on now in Muslim majority countries is also problematic when it comes to the way we deal with families, the way we deal with women. It's not for us to push to do it as it is done in the West, but to be critical enough to come to something which is, how do we deal with the right status for women in our societies today? And it means not headscarf or not headscarf. For me, it's clear. The headscarf is an Islamic prescription, and then after this, it should be the right of the woman to wear it or not. This is her free choice. But it's an Islamic prescription, and then you decide what you want to do. Now, this is not the main concern. The main concern is, how do you deal with the family? How do you deal with the husbands? When you deal with the kids? How do you deal with your rights? How do you deal with the surrounding society in the public sphere? These are questions that are deeper than that when you speak about, for example, something which is, for us, so obvious as Muslims. Same skills, same salary. Let us come to this. Let us come to these deep discussions, and not just following the footsteps of, I want to please the West, and say, okay, remove the headscarf and show that you are liberal Muslims. What's that? What's that? This is not reform. This is just an awareness. This is just silly. This is not what the Muslims need today.
Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum. If I could ask the question to both of you, that would be really helpful. How do Muslims have a meaningful engagement with government as active citizens in this country? I know you both touched on it, but if you could elaborate, that would be great.
Thank you very much. Could we start with Sheikh Hamza?
Yeah, Bismillah. Well, I would say the first thing is the Muslim community has to understand citizenship and the whole concept. In the pre-modern tradition, there wasn't a concept of citizenship. There's a concept of what's called hakim and mahkum, which is the ruler and the ruled. So the idea that people that are under a government can actually participate in the framing of the government itself is a relatively new idea. And Muslims in the West they're learning this. I mean, we now have, it's quite extraordinary that there's a minister who's from a Muslim family and some MPs that were elected in the recent elections that are from the Muslim community. So it's happening in the United Kingdom. But I would argue that the concept of muwatana, which is citizenship, the idea that we are not a minority community in the ideal state of Western understanding of citizenry, that we are actually fully enfranchised citizens and have all the rights and responsibilities that go with that citizenship. That has to be inculcated into our youth and into our communities. I think the older generation is, they're excused in my estimation because they came from a very different background, but the younger generation really doesn't have an excuse. I think it's very important that they recognize the importance of fully integrating at that level. Because in my country, for instance, in the United States, especially at local government, you can enact radical changes in your local governments. You can you can ban alcohol, you can ban gambling, you can do a lot of things. And Muslims, and I agree with Dr. Ramadan fully about this, that Muslims need to be productive members of the community. They really need to be engaging the community fully. And those people, one of the biggest problems that we have is the concept of al-wara and al-bara, the idea of there's a certain segment of the Muslim community that teaches this idea that any allegiance you have to have allegiance and enmity, which means allegiance to Islam alone and enmity to anything other than Islam, and therefore to vote is an act of kufr in a non-Muslim state. And we have people here that get public airspace to actually expound these ideas on a regular basis. These ideas are sectarian and a very, very marginalized minority view in Islamic history. Allegiance to a state is not kufr by any means. And Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayya argues that the classical formation of what was called Dar al-Harb, Dar al-Islam, and then Dar al-Ahad or Muwada'a, which is, those were the three classical formations: the abode of war, the abode of peace, which was the Islamic world, and then the abode where you had treaties with the people. He argues that there's a new abode, which is what he calls the Darul Maqam or Dar al-Muwatana, which is the abode of citizenship, which is where Muslims are citizens. And a Muslim can technically become a prime minister or at least a president in the United States, and that was argued 200 years ago. It was actually in the constitutional debates, one of the issues raised is that if there were not religious tests, a Muslim could eventually be elected president in the United States. That was argued 200 years ago by the Founding Fathers. And the argument was overridden because Ireton argued that if the American people elected a Muslim, it would be for one of two reasons. The Americans had all become Muslims, and then that was their democratic prerogative. And he said that's highly unlikely. And then he said the other would be that they found in a Muslim all the virtues that they wanted to lead their society, and in that case, again, it was their prerogative. So they actually voted early on based on a Muslim issue. And so Barack Obama has a Muslim grandmother, and he's president of the United States. His grandmother was there in hijab sitting next to him at the inauguration. So we now have a paternal side of the family in the White House that's Muslim, right? So, I mean, that's quite extraordinary as an event. And I think we can't underestimate the importance of the election of Barack Hussein Obama, because that election, first of all, signals that the name barrier no longer exists in the United States of America. If your name's Mahmoud or Hussein or Abdullah, it's not a barrier anymore. That's the first important hallmark. The second is that he does openly have Muslim relatives, and that is an incredible statement. And the third, and this is what I find most extraordinary, he's from the Luo tribe in Kenya. In Kenya, had he ran for president of Kenya, he could not have been elected because of the tribe that he's from. And that is a fact that Fuad Nehdi will confirm. The Luo tribe is a weaker tribe. but he overcame tribe and race in the United States and became president. So I think it's very important for Muslims to recognize that we do have a vital contribution. And finally, in Manchester, Bradford, Sheffield, Birmingham, in these cities, we are moving into numbers of Muslims that if the demographics are correct, and they often aren't, so I do put that caveat out, but if the demographics are correct, it won't be long before some of the largest cities in the United Kingdom have majority Muslim populations. The Muslims need to very seriously consider the fact that they will have to be running city councils, that they will have police stations that are under a Muslim constabulary. All these things have to be really taken into consideration, and Muslims, instead of rioting, they really need to think about establishing think tanks where they can think seriously about their presence in the United Kingdom and in the United States and in Canada and in Germany and all of these places, because we need to address these real issues, and we need to alleviate the very serious and real fears, and it's not always phobia, because phobia in a classical medical definition is an irrational fear. But the fear of Muslims is not necessarily irrational for many people. The high crime rates that are in our communities in Europe are cause for concern for many, many people in these countries. And so it's very important that the Muslims address these issues, and one of the most important ways of doing that is through civic engagement.
Yes, quite. I want to say something about this, because I agree with Sheikh Hamza Yusuf about, and I have been saying this for years now, when I wrote the book To Be a European Muslim, said that we have to stop, the very understanding of citizenship is to start speaking about minority and minority citizenship, and not to put ourselves in a situation where we speak as a minority. When it comes to citizenship, of course, the religious minority, it's there, but when we speak about citizenship, we have to be involved. Now, the point is that I'm not myself against anything which has to do with governments. I have been sitting in many, councils and committees with governments and talking and listening and sharing views. But once again, as I said, is really to ask yourselves, what is the intention? What do we want to achieve? Because at the end of the day, for example, when I studied all what was said by scholars about Dar al-Harb and Dar al-Islam and all that, I ended up saying that in the West, but as well as in the Muslim majority countries, we are today facing something which I call Dar al-Shahada, meaning by this that it's where you bear witness, meaning shahada in the sense that litakunu shuhada ala nas, in order for you to bear witness to your message before people. This is where the world is. I want to be a witness. So ask yourself, what is the intention? So there is something which is very problematic, is that some of the Muslims that are dealing with governments, they are acting as if they are representing the Muslims, and you are not. So first is just to say, I'm not representing all the Muslims. Second is to ask yourself, what is your role? And this is where I'm at exactly the point for me. It's a contribution. It's an ethical contribution. It's to help the politicians and to help the governments to come back to politics, and not emotional politics. It's not racism. It's not discrimination. It's just to be there for all the citizens. And to be there for all the citizens is just to be the witness of your message in the way you deal with politics. It doesn't mean that you have to be naive and not to calculate. It means that you have to be aware of the game and the rules of the game, but at the same time to show in which way, when you are dealing with the government, first, you don't represent the Muslims. Second, you want to spread around a better understanding of what is happening at the grassroots level. And then also to be able to say to the governments, look, you don't only have to deal with the people you like, but you need to deal with all the people in the community. And the last point is, never let them think that you can be both. Which I'm sorry, there are people that are working for the governments, getting money from the governments, and the only thing that they are doing is exactly just following the agenda of the governments, and I think that these people are dangerous.
Can I have one question from Sorry, no, from here, from the gentleman in the leather jacket.
Assalamu alaikum, Sheikh Hamza and Professor Ramadan. My question is addressed to both of you. You've both spoken of this notion in Islam of a thawabit, of constants or immutables within the Islamic tradition. How do both of you respond to those within the tradition and without the tradition who flag these thawabit up, some of these immutables, as concepts, as parts of the tradition which are incompatible with Western liberal democracies? And how, therefore, do you see a way forward? You know, because ultimately, I mean, oftentimes Islamic reform is seen as a means to further integration, okay, and these are often flagged up from both sides of the divide as impediments to achieving this goal.
Well, I mean, I would say that, first of all, the area that's problematic is what's known as ahkam sultaniya, which are the governmental categories and penal code. And that's where the real problem lies. There are issues about, I think, sexual morality, homosexuality, and also women's rights that are seen as problematic. The inheritance laws in the Quran are one of the few times when the Quran is very explicit about who gets what. And that's difficult, although there are some arguments even in juristic preference that some of the usuli scholars have made of late, arguing, you know, other types of distribution, you know, that is not incongruous with what the Quran says. But I would say that, you know, the Prophet ﷺ stated very clearly that the tradition, the political tradition of his faith would dissipate very rapidly after 30 years. And I think Muslims tend to forget that this so-called Islamic State has not existed in the history of Islam. And I think that it's a political fantasy that a lot of Muslims hold. And so I think a lot of those areas are not dissimilar to the Jewish Orthodox community and other religious communities that have pre-modern aspects of their tradition that are not compatible with Western liberal democracy. And I think it's important that Muslims don't waffle on those issues. I think that they should state them as they are. And simply, we believe this is a revelation, and there are certain things that are prohibited. In the Quran, homosexuality, acting on homosexuality is prohibited in the Quran. The impulses that people have a homosexual, that was addressed in our books centuries ago. The prayer of a person who's known as ma'boon, who has that condition of being attracted to the same sex, is a valid prayer, even if they lead the prayer. That's mentioned in Maliki texts. But the idea of acting on it, and also just purely rectal intercourse for male and female, is also prohibited. It's simply seen as something that harms people, so that physical act is prohibited. And Muslims, I don't think, can change that in any way, because it's ma'lum min ad-din daruratan, it's known by all Muslims, and it really can't be waffled or fudged. On the other hand, I think it's important to humanize people and not to dehumanize people, and I think that the types of attitudes that a lot of Muslims have are incompatible with the spirit of mercy and of rahmah. And the other thing which is important is that people outside of the faith of Islam, according to the opinion that I was taught and that I hold, are not in any way obliged to follow the details of the Islamic law. So what is prohibited for us is not necessarily prohibited for them if they don't accept Islam as a tradition.
Yes, there are many things here. I think that I agree on almost all what was said. Yes, I agree with all what was said, but I want to be more focused on one of the points that you are making. Very often, as Muslims, because we are under pressure, you know, there is in many countries today in the West some, you know, a list of questions, and you have to respond to these questions, and you are going to be a good and a bad Muslim, depending on your answer. So there is a list of questions. And the point is that even with some of our texts, when we come to something which is not dealing with the text, but an intrinsic discussion from within, that we have to consider, you know, some of the texts that are قطع الثبوت وقطع الدلالة, meaning that there is no discussion about the authenticity and no discussion about the substance and the meaning. It's that Muslims are, if we are not, sharp and coming with something which is a definitive response to this, it's as if we are less Muslims. So let me give you two examples. There is one thing which is quite important, is that we have clear-cut texts and they have to be implemented, but sometimes the context within which you live needs to be taken into account to know what you are going to do with this. When, for example, with Muslims, you should know this. Half of the Muslim organizations in this country stopped to invite me when I was calling for a moratorium on the hudud. Because some were saying, oh, you are questioning the very essence of the text. You are questioning the text themselves. I never did that. I never did that. You will never find in anything that I wrote something which is saying it's not in the Quran, it's not in the prophetic tradition. The death penalty is in the Quran, the corporal punishments are in the Quran, and the stoning is in the prophetic tradition. I never said that it's not text. What I am saying is that the conditions to implement these texts are not there, so it's impossible to implement. So the best way is not to pretend in some, petromonarchies that we are fulfilling or being faithful to Islam, because the first intentions is faithfulness, is, I think, is just unjust. What we are doing in the name of Islam. So it's not because it's the liberal democracy that someone said, oh, it's a European, it's a Swiss citizen teaching us Islam. I responded to this, no, it's a Muslim asking you as a Muslim, is it Islamic what we are doing? And like the Mufti, Sheikh Ali Jom'a responded, coming to say that the substance, he was not in agreement with the methodology, not the way I did it, but with the substance, saying, yes, I agree with the substance that we cannot implement this. And I got many scholars that were agreeing on principles, but not publicly. After a discussion in Morocco, some say, we agree with you, but we are not going to say it. But this is a point which is crisis of authorities, that we are scared of the reputation of what the Muslims are going to say about us. So my point here is to say, on your discussion, that there are some principles that we have in order to be faithful to look at the environment. Now, on some of the principles, when it comes to homosexuality, when it comes to some of these issues, and some Muslims are pushed, yet you have to accept this, that you should, I think no. And this is why it's quite important to be able to come with something which is clear as to the principles and open as to humanity, and to humanize. What I say is to respect the people and to disagree with what you are doing. I don't like it. It's not permitted in my religion, but I respect who you are, and this is the way I am. This is the way I should be in this society. So the Muslims are so much on the defensive that this attitude is sometimes perceived as, oh, you are betraying the very essence of the religion. And I would say exactly the opposite. It's the very essence of the religion that we are protecting by being clear on the principles and open in what are the relationships that we have with people.
Thank you very much. Can I take a question from the gentleman here?
Assalamu alaikum. Bassem Al-Kar with the Council on American Islamic Relations and the Democratic Party. Many communities and mosques in the West are held hostage by a few. These leaders do not give space to others, especially the youth. They drive and alienate our youth away from the faith. How do we deal with the issue of community leadership, the crisis in community leadership?
Can I direct that question to Sheikh Hamza?
Well, leadership's, it's an interesting, there's a principle in Islam that the ruler removes difference of opinion. So for instance, in Ramadan, when do we start? In the West, we have problems, like in America, which day do we start? They don't have a problem in Egypt, because they just announced it's Ramadan tomorrow, everybody fasts. So because leadership is a fluid thing, and leadership is about authority, and peoples have different levels of authority. Dr. Ramadan yields a certain amount of authority. I yield a certain amount of authority, but we don't have the type of authority that Hosni Mubarak has in Egypt. And so it becomes, you can't just dictate to people what to do. You can try to convince them with arguments. And that's really what I believe Islam is about. The Quran is about convincing people with arguments and dialectic. And also, it's a give and take process. So I think it's important that, especially the youth leaders, they have their authority. They begin to emerge. People like Rami Nashashibi is a good example in the United States, Intisar Rab. I mean, there are many examples. Cream tends to rise to the top. That leadership is something that often is organic, even in a political process, it's organic. And that doesn't, I mean, it can be spoiled cream as well, you know, so it doesn't necessarily mean it's always good leadership, but leaders tend to display certain qualities that people respond to, and I think it's more of an organic process than trying to superimpose on people some models.
Yes, but very, very quickly, I would say something here, which is I have a problem with these questions because it's very, we are facing these questions very often, and some young Muslims are saying, how can we get, a new leadership? At the end of the day, there are two things that are very important. Once again, I'm always coming back to this, which is the intention of what do you want to achieve. Is it a power struggle, or is it something which is our contribution? And how are we going to be more effective in the environment? And there's something else which is working, is that when you do the job, when the eldest are just seeing on the ground that you are doing the job, at the end of the day, stop being the victim. It's exactly the same with women. You want an emancipation process, you want to be free, you want to be autonomous, you want to do the work, do it. Just go for it. And I think that many, many experiences, not only here, I can tell you that even in Muslim majority countries, when I went to Indonesia, when I met these young people in Malaysia, when they were working in computering, they are doing the job. They go, they do it. Now, it doesn't mean that you have to go to be against the old leadership. It's just to be a complementary voice, but do the job. And then also, men, young people, this is the way this has to be done. And then your knowledge of your environment, your knowledge of the environment should be brought to the fore as something which is effective in the way. So respect, this is coming from the tradition, is something which is important, but critical thinking and creativity, we lack creativity in our methodologies. We lack creativity in the way we come with, to reform within Islam is sometimes the means that you are using to reach the people. So these are things that they are necessary, and I would say that our communities are too much passive.
I need to bounce off that a little bit, because part of the problem is, Toynbee argues that the fundamental crisis in civilization is when challenges they confront challenges, they don't have creative responses. And he argues that creative responses are indeed what saves a civilization. And part of the problem is some of the best and brightest minds that we have no longer go into Islamic studies. They go into medicine. We have incredibly creative responses in medicine to the challenges of medicine. We have incredibly creative responses to engineering. I mean, they're always coming up with new ways to build higher buildings. My God, I was just in Dubai, and that thing, it's almost a Pleiades. But the problem is that when you direct so much of your intellectual energies into these other areas and fields of expertise, and you don't direct those energies into some of the most difficult questions that face us, which are philosophical, they are ethical. We need real ethicists. We need people that are trained in ethical philosophy, not just a kind of modern book on ethics. I mean, if you read classical ethical treatises, they are philosophical treatises that teach people how to reason ethically. Not simply having a hadith that tells you some ethical truism, but to reason ethically, because if we had people reasoning ethically, we would never have come up with fatwas that supported suicide bombing, ever.
My question is actually for both Dr. Ramadan and Sheikh Hamza. Sheikh Hamza first, don't you think that there is a need as well for some kind of institutional reform for our religious schools? Like where I come from, for example, in Azhar, we had a very interesting experience towards the end of the 18th century in 1997 or around that time when the French came to Egypt. one of the shuyukh, Shaykh al-Islam Hassan al-Attar, he actually realized out of all the shuyukh of Azhar that there is a need for him to explore the French, these invaders who actually came to the country, and try to teach them Arabic and get some engineering knowledge and stuff like that. And that has actually paved the road for people like Rifa' al-Tahtawi to come to Paris and other shuyukh to come to Europe and explore. So don't you think that there is a need actually to reform our institutions of Islamic learning within the Muslim world as well? And as our Sheikh Ali Jum'ah speaks about the importance of regenerating sciences, as our predecessors have done that.
I just wanted to ask a question on behalf of all the government officials here, and I should point out at this stage, I'm from The Guardian, but is it a given that reform or renovation, whatever terms you want to use, that it will make it less likely that Muslims will be involved in violence against the interests of the West or what the West perceives to be an interest? Is it a guaranteed, or is there, based my questions about unintended consequences?
Okay, and we had one pre-submitted question from Imam Sarwar of Iqra TV. Some Muslims would hold that Islam can sit perfectly comfortably within a secular society, and the religion does not oblige us to work to change the political status quo. In this light, can it be argued that a Muslim can be a neoconservative and a good Muslim at the same time?
Just to answer the question about renewal of the colleges, I mean, I studied in a traditional methodology. A lot of it was rote memorization, and there's a fundamental need for memorization in the Islamic tradition, undeniably. But on the other hand, there has to be other components, and particularly a critical reading of texts, and that has to be incorporated into the students' understanding early on. So, I would definitely argue, Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayya, recently we were at Al-Azhar, and he gave a talk and argued that 4 subjects need to be renewed, tajdeed. And he said that the first was usul al-fiqh, which I think in many ways he's done. I mean, he wrote this extraordinary book, Sina'at al-Fatwa, which is the craft of giving fatwa, showing the methodology of how to do that. And the second one was furu' al-fiqh, which is the branches of jurisprudence. And the third was tasawwuf, like the need for renewal of tasawwuf as the spiritual component or the inward reality of the Sharia. And I don't think historically there was always an understanding of Sharia and tariqah, that there's an inward road to God and there's an outward road, and they have to be traversed at the same time by the same individual. And the final one was the aqidah itself. Many of the aqidah, the creedal issues that are discussed in madrasas are absolutely absurd in the light of modern science and even physics. I mean, there are now knowledge in modern physics that solves a lot of the early problems that they were discussing, and they were trying to do it. So there needs to be a renewal. On the other hand, it's a work that needs what Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayya says, it needs a vast knowledge. It can't be done by pygmies. It really has to be done by people that are capable and really highly qualified to do that. And then in terms of the Guardian question about reform and violence, I mean, I would argue Zbigniew Brzezinski, who's quite brilliant Polish American, I heard him once in a lecture talk about the response to the black nationalist violent movements in the United States of America, and he said there was a multi-dimensional approach to that problem. One of them was curtailing the violence, which was a criminal justice problem. But he said the other one was addressing the real issues that were creating the violence. And as long as we don't address a lot of these issues, and I'll just give you one example. I've read in so many articles, Mortimer Zuckerman or whoever, arguing Palestine's not really an issue, blah, 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 it's just an excuse, rubbish. I was just in Morocco. Which is at the edge of the Arab world. It's the furthest Western Arab country. And in Fez, in one of the most traditional cities in the Muslim world, the khatib, who was well into his 70s, he ended his khutbah by praying for Quds, by liberating Quds, by asking God to help the Palestinian people in their oppressed conditions. This is happening all across the Muslim world every Friday. And until people really seriously address this issue, and the British of all people should be addressing this issue, because a lot of the problem stems from early British policies in that area. My country inherited the problems. Yeah.
And thirdly, to Sheikh Hamza, can a Muslim be a neoconservative and a good Muslim at the same time?
A neocon, I like con is where we end it in America, so, and then you could say, por qué neo, why neo-fascism? Why not just call a spade a spade? So I think it's impossible for somebody to be true to any real humanity in their hearts, to follow a completely, patently disingenuous political discourse, really disingenuous. They can still be a Muslim, though. I don't excommunicate. Yeah.
Yes, just to go for I think that, once again, I think it's a serious discussion about Al-Azhar and what you said. Because I think that, when I went there, and I had the choice to go to Al-Azhar and to follow the traditional, and to go with, one-to-one courses, Sheikh Ali Goma and others who were teachers and professors there, and ulama min Al-Azhar. And I decided to go for this on a one-to-one courses with all the scholars. Because I think that there is something that should be kept, which is still the tradition and the pillars. These are very important. Now, once again, the methodology, when it comes to the way we are teaching by heart, and when you repeat, I was with, in Usul al-Fiqh, for example, and we have to repeat all this qawaid, and you get the knowledge when you know them by heart. We are not sure to understand the substance, and the critical discussion on this. I think that there is a problem of methodology, there is a problem of substance, there is a problem of what was said, the critical mind, which is to learn to ask questions, which is the very tradition of Islam, to ask questions, to question the scholars. I agree that we have a problem of authority, but the problem that we have also now with authority is just this blind authority when we have a sheikh, is that don't ask the question, just follow. I'm sorry, this is not. And this is why when this one-to-one course that I had, every morning with Sheikh Ali Juma, it was a discussion, it was taking and giving, and I think that this is what we need to come. And once again, what Muhammad Abdu said when he was coming back to Al-Azhar was something of this kind. He said, we need other disciplines, but he was also talking about the way things are taught. And I think that this is what we need. Now, in the West, in Muslim-majority countries, we need to do this in Muslim-majority countries, but we need now to institutionalize our presence with institutions in the West doing the job. So to have this credential now, by having scholars coming from there and working here. Because in our environment, we need this. It's impossible to be a scholar, a Muslim scholar, knowing the state of affairs in our countries in the West, if we don't get this critical thinking, understanding, and it's vast. And this is why it's not one who can do that. It's not two. It's something which has to be a collective. We need to make it clear for the Muslim community, don't only put money in mosques, but put money in institutions and put money in things that are how we're going to teach. This is something which is essential. Now, the second thing which is important, let me tell you something here, which is, you spoke about Palestine. I was in the task force in this country, and I was also, for example, I was banned from the United States of America. 80% of the questions that I got at the American Embassy in Switzerland were about my position on Iraq and my position on the unilateral support of the United States towards Israel. It has nothing to do with the money I gave. It has to do really with political position. So there is only one way forward. If we accept critical discussion in politics, being able to say there is a lack of consistency in the West with our values, this is the only way for us to be heard by Muslims when we say you can't kill innocent people. This is not Islamic. What I said straight after July the 7th is anti-Islamic. When I was in the States, in New York, just after what happened on September the 11th, it's not only non-Islamic, it's anti-Islamic. We cannot support this. We cannot, no, please. But the point is, the point is for us, is really to know where we are, with whom we are talking. So when now we have some Muslims being able to work with the governments and supporting the inconsistency of the governments when they are saying condemn violence and don't speak about other things. No, I'm sorry. There is not going to work. It's not going to work. There is no way for us to go towards peace if we are not serious about consistency in politics, meaning the blood of an Iraqi man is the same as the blood of an American man. If this is not the... No. This is the starting point of our discussion. It's the starting point of our discussion. I'm sorry to say that some in our governments, just I'm finishing on this, on 2 points, but this point, really, I think that it's very serious. It's very serious because we are not going to solve the problem if every time we come with this discourse, our loyalty to our country is challenged and questioned. It's questioned. It's that, oh, you are not a real British, you are not a real American. I think it's wrong. This is where we are, the dignity of Britain, the dignity of the United States of America, when we are able to say this as Muslims. So this is our contribution. I would say that if you deal with governments, if you deal with, the Labour Party in this country, it's just to say, I'm sorry, what you are doing is wrong. So you had the Prime Minister in this country saying there is no connection between what happened in the streets of London and what we are doing in Iraq. So how can you start a discussion when there is such a state of denial that it's wrong what was done in the streets of London, but please say that's wrong what you are doing in Iraq and what you are forgetting in Palestine. But not only, by the way, I'm of this opinion. I really want us as citizens not only to speak about Palestine, not only to speak about Iraq and Afghanistan, but also to speak about Africa, but also to speak about the fact that people are being killed and for example, even in what happened in Haiti, for example, it's just before the natural catastrophe, the way we are dealing with these governments and these corrupt people there. I think that this is where we have to be involved. And this is, for me, a shift in our understanding. But I want our fellow citizens and the governments to understand what we are talking about when we are talking about this. And then one thing which is important, I completely agree, a neocon and being a Muslim is problematic in my mind. I don't get it. But there is something which is going to be very difficult for all of us. In our involvement in the West, and this happened in Muslim majority countries in a way which was problematic because when you were following Islamist trends, this is where you were a good Muslim and it's as if all the others were bad Muslims. We have to be very cautious here in this political discussion because today we have Muslims that are not going as extreme as neocon or far-right party and populist, but we will have people in the Labour parties. That we will have people in the Lib Dem and in the Conservative. We have Muslims as citizens now, they are everywhere. And we need to be able now to get to that level of political understanding as citizens that we may have the same faith, we don't share the same opinions. So there is something here which is very important in our way of dealing. We have to deal with this political diversity as something which is a potential richness and not a liability undermining our community of faith. It's not easy. It's really not easy because this judgmental attitude that we can have on the name of our religion because we come from something which is a very specific understanding of Islam could be problematic in the political field. In our life in the West, this is the challenge also of diversity that we have to deal with.
Thank you. Thank you.
This is a very direct submitted question, but no less pertinent. Do both speakers believe that the relationships fostered under the New Labour with counter-extremist think tanks such as Quilliam have been productive or counterproductive? And is it something that the coalition government should put efforts in pursuing?
Okay, can we start with Professor Ramadan?
I'm from America.
Look, my position on this, it's not a black and white. Because today, with Quilliam, I am differentiating between people and the objective. There are some people I don't want to talk to them because I have no trust. That's over. I saw, I heard, thank you. Some others that I think that they are trying their best in between. So I would say I'm not against the fact that we are in touch with the government. It depends on your intention and what you are producing and delivering on the ground. Today, for me, some of the things that are done by, for example, the Quilliam Foundation are completely counterproductive. Completely counterproductive. And some other things, no. No, that's not right. That's not right. It's something which is, we need to have, this is exactly the opposite of what I wanted. I don't want this kind of, just throwing away something which is a project. It's just, I think that some things are counterproductive. And I think that there are other things, other questions that are very, very important. I think that some of the questions that are coming from the Quilliam Foundation and others are very important to listen to. So I'm against this kind of attitude that sometimes we have, oh, it's coming from Quilliam, throw it away. No, listen. Listen. For example, let me tell you something which is not only coming from within the Muslim community, but we have, for example, Brigitte Bardot. Brigitte Bardot. She's from the far right. Very bad. She doesn't like the Muslims. She's clearly a racist. She's a racist. And say they are starting with the sheep and then they will end with us, by slaughtering us. That's fine. This is what she's saying. But there is something which is very important for me. I'm not going to react emotionally. I'm going to tell her, look, you are racist, the way you are dealing with Arabs and Muslims, I will never accept that. But at the same time, she's saying something which is important. Look, Muslims, the way you are dealing with the animals, when it comes to Eid al-Adha, is just not respectful. You are disrespectful towards, and I listen to this, I say, in all these you are wrong, and on this you are right. I will listen to this and forget about all that. And I think it's exactly the same with the Quilliam Foundation. I'm ready to throw away 90% because I think it's counterproductive, and the 10% welcome to the discussion.
Thank you very much. Can I take it from the lady here, please? Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum. It's probably not a very sophisticated question. It's more of a practical, real question. I've been just listening, trying to take everything in that you've been saying, but at the same time, as somebody who is very active and has been very active in both Ireland and here, at grassroots level, working with women's groups, Muslim women's groups and non-Muslim, and the youth. My own experience, if that's anything to go by, of activism has left me quite soured and disappointed, actually. And how do you reconcile I suppose that's the question, how do you reconcile the prophetic injunction to plant saplings in the middle of the hour with the reality that actually for a lot of Muslims it's very hard. The reality of raising children here is very hard. Some people can tell us, go back to your own countries. Well, I don't belong anywhere, or I belong as much here as I belong anywhere. And I find it hard. I find the engagement genuinely hard. And I think that reflects the reality of quite a lot of people, young and older, trying to raise children, trying to communicate with children, values that everything else around you says.
Right.
You're an outsider, it's very difficult.
Yeah. The Prophet ﷺ, he said, that Islam began as an alien thing and it will return to being an alien thing. So blessed are the alienated ones. And the world is an alienating place, and we're all going to be dead in this room within at least, the maximum 100 years, and there'll be a whole new group of people debating and discussing, maybe not. But, you know, it is very difficult. And I was on an airplane going to Kuwait, and I sat next to Muhammad al-Awadi, who's a famous TV presenter there, very brilliant Kuwaiti guy. And the stewardess came, and she had Aisha on her name tag, and I asked her where she was from. She said Senegal. And then Muhammad al-Awadi, she didn't have a hijab on, but he said, are you able to pray on the plane? And she said, yes. And then he said, can I ask you a question? And she said, yes. And he said, how do you feel about serving wine on the plane? She said, it's really hard. But I always use my left hand. And, you know, I was so moved by that attempt in such an incredibly difficult circumstance to be as true as she could to what she believed was right, because Muslims do deal with foul things with their left hand, and a lot of people struggling out there. So God bless you.
If, you know, there is no way to deny the fact that educating our kids and you know, today, to be a couple is a jihad. To be a father and to be a mother is a jihad. And to be a kid, to be a boy or a girl is in itself a jihad. The starting point is exactly this one, is just to acknowledge the fact that it's very difficult. But now there are also conditions. And I would say that in the West, it's very difficult today to be a father and a mother, but there are conditions, and we have to come back to this. When I wrote the book on the Prophet, peace be upon him, the point for me was really to look at the way he was and to extract from his behavior principles. There is something which is very problematic. When you are scared from the environment, you know, when you are full of confidence, it's different than when you are scared. When you are scared from the environment, you come with rules because you think that rules are protecting you. But when you come with a state of, you know, confidence, you know that it's going to be difficult, but you say, نَتَوَكَّلُ عَلَى اللَّهِ, we rely on God and we go for it. There is something which is conditions. And the first one is, look at the way the Prophet, peace be upon him, was with his wife and with his kids. The first thing which is important is communication. And there is no way today in our schools or supplementary schools or sometimes Islamic schools, we come with the rules and we forget the fact that we need communication. We need to let the people express. So I would say that in our family, there is something which is quite important, is communicating, is to listen, is to be able to look and to have this, you know, the signs that are coming from. And I think that this is missing today, lack of communication. The second thing which is important in the way we deal with our kids here, it's critical thinking, is also to let them, you know, asking questions and sometimes make mistakes and try to deal with the environment. And the third thing which is for me important is not to cut them from the surrounding society, is to equip them with critical thinking and being able to make some choice. It's not going to be easy. No one said that, but communicating, critical thinking, and then trust. Trust. You know, I always say something which is part of my personal experience. When my own father once, I asked him something, he gave it to me, he gave money to me and say, don't do something which is displeasing God. And he was sending me a message that I'm not even able myself to do with my own kids, which is trusting this, you know, relationship with, you know, your conscience. So I think that once again, we need to do this within our family. But we need institutions, we need, you know, places where we can talk about this. And sometimes there is nothing wrong with having people helping us, or mediators, or even psychologists sometimes when it comes to, we need this. And I would say that these Muslims that say, okay, the only answer is go to pray, that's fine, I know that I have to pray, but we are not solving the problem. So I would say that once again, it's a question of, it's difficult, but we have the responsibility to find the right means where we are to solve the challenges when we are. So living in the West, this is a community responsibility, is to try to find these ways. And sometimes you are dealing exactly with the same answers that I have, is that we are very far from understanding the problems and coming with the right answers. So I would say that yes, but once again, there is something which is today helping us. When you look at the last 30 years, the Muslims today are doing much better than before. So we have to carry on and to try to find the right institutions and the right way to deal with the young girls and the young women. And please, don't only come with halal and haram, don't do this, don't do that, while we still have to come with something which has to do with authority. And I would say something which is, you are a woman and you talk about this, and one of the most important problems that we have today in our families has nothing to do with women. It has to do with men. It has to do with fathers. No, I'm not saying this to please anyone. I'm just saying we are not serious about this challenge. We are not. There is something which is very deep here, which is the father, the role, and this relationship. And I would say that this is something that we all have to keep in mind.
Thank you very much. We really have come to the end of our time today. Can I just ask our media representative, Miriam, to sum up?
Wow, what an insightful journey we've been on tonight, alhamdulillah. We've laughed, we've cried, we've done perhaps a lot of the in-between. And I think that the breadth of emotions that we've possibly been through tonight is somewhat testimony to the vast array of issues that we're facing as Muslims. I'm just going to ask you for 5 minutes so that we can thank everyone for their involvement in tonight's event. As you can imagine, it wasn't a one-man show. We'd obviously like to thank our speakers, Sheikh Hamza and Professor Tariq Ramadan, for being with us here tonight. We'd like to thank you, the audience, because of course you're a major component of the show and you've made it what it is. The ISOC team, we'll get the applause at the end, please, inshallah. The ISOC team, in particular Imad, for heading up this gargantuan operation and taking it from a seed to the fantastic event we've had tonight, alhamdulillah. Reem, wherever she is, probably organizing, for being a management whiz and the queen of multitasking. Nawaz, Sazan, Kauthar, Imran, Arzu, Amir, and so many others for their delightful phone manner and powers of persuasion, not to mention tenacity and resistance to sleep deprivation. Salman and Rahul for being technological genii, all of our stewards here tonight, Sheikh Babikar for being an inspiration to us at all times, and everyone who made this evening possible. Can I thank you all? Thank you so much. Assalamu alaikum. Peace be upon you.